Hello, welcome to the second meeting of the EPPP2 Taskforce. We'll have Mr. Glass-Beagle call the roll.
Actually, Miss Burns today.
Oh, Miss Burns. I apologize.
Yeah.
Here.
Here.
Elchgandy,
Here.
Bellure,
Here.
Loxham,
Here.
Bradbury, Dottie, Chow, Briscoe Smith,
Here.
Coleman, Quebec, Sedler, Bellick.
All right. So again, it's nice to see everyone here for the EPPP2 second meeting for this task force. I appreciate everyone taking their time off of their busy schedules to help us with this task. I also want to thank the outstanding job of Ms. Snyder in organizing this meeting and helping prepare all the materials. So we have a full agenda today, so I want to remind everyone that our goal for today is to have a recommendation to the full board, which will be meeting on August 16 to 17. So it's our goal to get through all the agenda items and just to remind everyone to keep all the comments and discussions related to the current agenda item. That way we can get through everything. We're probably going to have a couple of breaks and then we'll hope to have lunch sometime around noon. And so we can get started. We'll start with public comments for items not on the agenda, and I just want to remind everyone that the committee may not discuss or take action on any matters raised during this public comment section, except to decide whether to place the matter on the agenda for a future meeting. Any public comments? Being as there's none, we'll move on to the next agenda item. So you all have a copy of the EPPP Task Force minutes from April 5th, 2018. So, does anyone want to pass a motion to approve the minutes?
Move the minutes.
Anyone second? Okay. Good. We're doing a really good job moving on the agenda items. So we'll go to agenda number 5, which is... Okay. Okay, gotcha. So let's discuss first, the minutes. Anyone have a comment on the minutes from last April?
I think it is on. Okay, oh, I wasn't speaking into it. Okay, so I just have a question. So last time there was a vote taken, but there was also a request for additional information from ASPPB, and so that letter went out. So in light of the new information that's been received, is there a way to then factor that into the vote, or is the vote considered done?
We will be discussing the letter, actually, the response to the letter and the response to the letter on agenda number 5.
Right, but but there was a vote already to basically allow the new exam, I guess, to, or am I misinterpreting that?
I'll just say,
Okay, so it doesn't, there aren't, it's not as though that's already determined and that we then move on from that point based on the vote.
it's up to us to decide whether or not to reopen an issue or not.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you for the
We'll
clarification.
address this on the next agenda item. Thank you.
Sure.
So right now we're just like entertaining comments about the minutes, if there's any corrections or changes. And I just want to remind everyone that when you're speaking, to make sure that your microphones are on and that you put it really close to your mouth. Thank you. Any public comments on the agenda, the meeting minutes from last April? Seeing as there's none, we can vote to. Oh, you have one.
A quick comment on line 101, 100 and 101. It says that Mr. Fu stated that the new part of the examination will need to be implemented. I don't think I said it with that much surety. I think it was just a reflection of the comments of, so maybe the line should be, Mr. Fu stated that the new part of the examination will need to be considered for implementation, but not necessarily so sure in terms of that current phrase. Was that clear? Great, thank you.
And I do have a question about that. So it hasn't been determined, because that's how I read that sentence. Was that the new part of the exam will need to be implemented? The decision already been made?
No, the decision hasn't been made, and that's why I'm suggesting we make a change to the language.
Great, thank you.
I think it was just a reflection on the comments and the discussion at that point. So,
Just one more clarification. As it says in the minutes, we did not vote to recommend that the EPPP2 be accepted by the California board. We actually did not just vote on that at all. We simply moved to the second item on our agenda because basically it was de facto we didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. So we decided not to vote on that or not to recommend anything to the Board of Psychology.
There a change necessary to the minutes? Okay.
Any other changes to the minutes? Any public comments? Can we have a vote to approve the minutes?
Minutes as amended.
move to adopt the minutes as amended.
And then we can proceed with the vote. Aye.
Fu,
Aye.
Welch Gandy,
Aye.
Bell,
Aye.
Bloxham,
Aye.
Bradbury,
Aye.
Downey, Chow, Briscoe Smith,
Aye.
Finkel, Beck.
Aye. Thank you.
Sorry, Ms. Burns, we missed one of the committee members on the roll call.
Which one is it? Belik. Okay, Belik.
Is wrong here on this one.
We should have everybody now. Motion passes.
Thank you. Okay, so now we can move to agenda item number 5, which is the review and discussion of ASPPB's response to the EPPP2 Task Force letter regarding questions and concerns raised at the April 5, 2018 Task Force meeting. So we have Dr. Turner here with us today from ASPPB. So on your packet, there is a copy of the letter that we sent to ASPPB. Attachment A. And then attachment B is the response that ASPPB. Wait, got the response? Yeah. That was sent to us. So basically in the letter that we sent, this is from the last meeting, we were interested in knowing about the factors that led to the decision to create the 2 examinations, given that the concerns for additional costs, and with regards the issue of the requirements to take the EPPP Part 1, because there's a difference between what ASPPB is allowing versus the current California regulations. So we wanted to have those questions answered, and we also have some questions with regards possible changes in the cost due to cost concerns, as well as delaying implementation questions with regards the EPPP2. And lastly, we wanted to know more about the formal process that ASPPB considers the feedback from the member boards. So, has everyone reviewed the response from ASPPB and opening it for review and comments? Discussion. Okay, Mr. Fu?
Thank you, Dr. Turner, for returning.
Can you hear me all right?
There should be a green light by the gray button if it's on.
Green light. Can you hear me now? Okay, thanks.
So quick, since the letter was sent in response to the questions, is there an update related to the cost of the examination? And in the letter, it states that the ASPPB is considering options to decrease the hardship associated with increased fees to candidates. Could you share with us potentially what are some of the options you are considering, and what is the decision timeline that the ASPPB is using to come to a conclusion of what those options would be?
Well, this idea was well received by the board. They've asked that we have an implementation task force that meet and discuss some of the options. So we're really okay. Is that better? So we're reviewing everything. I think across the board in terms of costs and how we might do this. So we don't have a decision on that or specific options outlined as of right now. The board will meet again in October, so I'm hopeful that we'll have some hard decisions at that time.
Thank you.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
And Dr. Marcel, I'm the current president of the California Psychological Association, and I work at one of the training institutes, Palo Alto University. Do you all know or have any idea how many EPPP test takers also do a test prep course?
I imagine that many people do, but I don't have data on the numbers that do versus don't.
Because I imagine too, I mean, most of the students and early career psychologists I know do that at considerable cost. So we're not only considering adding an additional test and test fee, but also probably an additional test prep course as well, which will have a significant impact on those students who have financial difficulties.
Yeah, we understand that there is additional costs. We're hopeful that with the early entry option, we know from our own data that the closer that people take the EPPP to graduation, the higher the pass rates. So part of the impetus with that is not necessarily just pass rates, but the logic of doing a general global knowledge exam close to your graduate level training. So we're hopeful that the reliance on the test prep companies will be decreased. Hopeful that the pass rates will also increase.
Yeah, I'll add that, I mean, some of my colleagues are enthusiastic about that, the possibility of having the EPPP1 occur earlier and closer to the course. Again, it just cost, and the comments in the letter about that being included in student loans, while that may be attractive, the student loan debt for our graduates is enormous, and adding anything else to that's problematic.
I also comment regarding that. Sorry to be behind you there. I just wanted to follow up on Dr. Marcial's comments and encourage folks to kind of continue to consider the economic cost of this. So as is articulated, it's not only the cost of the $600, it's also the anticipated cost of the test prep. The other additional issue is really trying to think, while in some ways it might be helpful to push it into graduate school, as I'm working with students who are in their last year, I'm trying to figure out when they will take that test. So typically in the last year, I'm working and supporting students on applying to internship and completing dissertation, and I don't know when a test would actually really happen. My concern is actually by pushing it into the graduate school experience, it will actually delay the amount of time that people are gonna, before they even apply to internship, which actually cost-wise would be a considerable amount of money, because people might kind of use that as yet another thing that they have to get done before they go. And then add yet another year and a year of tuition. So the cost issues to this, I'm anticipating, might be quite prohibitive and also really quite concerning for students with socioeconomic disadvantage.
Sure.
So while I was going through the materials, it keeps on being articulated that it's a $600 cost, but I would really like to anticipate and really think thoroughly about that this is could be way more than that, given that it might actually delay time of exit, add another year, and the test prep requirements.
The plan for early entry is after all of coursework is done. So someone would be able to take that prior to internship if they like. It's also optional. It's not required. So I would encourage students to do this, because I know as a student that I would prefer to do it, and I think that would be the most comfortable time for me to take it. It's not required.
Yeah, I think just the consideration of, again, it differs per program. I've been in a number of programs here, but when in that last year, given dissertation, given applying to internship, so even working with students who've already completed their coursework, the amount of time that it will take to both apply to internship, which pretty much in effect wipes out your fall, and then trying to complete dissertation work, which not everyone has to do. So, you could let dissertation happen in internship, and then by the time you move to internship, it's a full-time internship, 44 hours at least. So, I mean, really just thinking clearly about when that happens, this additional test. While the proximity to the graduate school, I think, will help kind of increase the rates of passing, I do anticipate that it is going to be a hardship for a number of students to try to figure out how to master that in their last year. Just wanting to kind of raise up some of those issues that I'm hearing from my own students, and just considerations of that last year is already a pretty packed year prior to internship.
I hear both sides of the argument from trainers. This is an interesting issue because some are adamantly opposed to doing it, and then some.
I have like another kind of follow-up to just add about the economic hardship on students, especially when it's 100% increase in the cost of EPPP. Are there any considerations being made to, are there any considerations being made to lower the cost of the part 1 of the EPPP as part of just like a,
I think we're reviewing everything, so we don't have options as of right now, but I think we heard not just this task force, but everyone's concerns about it. Okay, how's that?
That's better.
Oh, no problem.
Hey, Matt. I know we've had this discussions about costs every single time I've gone to an ASPPB meeting.
Right.
And it hasn't, there are development costs and there's maintenance costs and it's an expensive thing to do, but I feel like it's that the decision, that what I'm trying to say is that ASPB is probably going to keep the cost of where it is. They've already had these discussions internally about the costs involved, and it's probably not going to change because you guys have already had these discussions. So I would just let people know that my feedback is from being at these meetings is that it's not likely to change, but we can always push back. The other thing I want to point out is that for people that may not know it, that ASPPB did give responses to the data. They referred to it in one response to one of our questions about feedback, the formal process for soliciting feedback. And it wasn't in the packet that was mailed out, but it was in the packet that we received today that gave the listserv responses by jurisdiction, so that just people were aware of that. And regarding that, one important thing is that California is not listed on here, which is an internal issue for California to deal with in terms of, despite having a member of the BOP also being on or because we have a member of the BOP also being on the SPPB board, there's such a strict conflict of interest wall between the two. The California Board of Psychology Minders, it seems like we're not informed at all about what was happening. I don't know if that's true, but with Dr. Horn being on the ASPPB board, there's a strict wall to prevent her interacting. How aware was the Board of Psychology of what ASPPB was doing? And so we could have addressed it earlier, possibly.
If I could try and address this issue, ASPPB has been communicating with the California Board of Psychology about the EPPP2 for a few years now. In fact, I believe you did a presentation at one of our board meetings where you talked about the part 2 of the exam. And that was, I want to say, last August. Not last August, but the August before in Emeryville. So we have been in communication. We've had a couple of webinars about the upcoming exam. We were not present at ASPPB. I believe it was the meeting in Hawaii where there was some kind of vote that occurred. We didn't get approved to attend that. We actually didn't even put in the request because it's not a location that we would get approval to travel to in California. So there was no voting, but we weren't a part of when there was some kind of voting for the adoption of the EPPP2. But we have been in communication, and ASPPB has been communicating with the board for a few years now on this.
Okay.
I wasn't at the October meeting, but I don't know if there was a formal vote rather than an announcement of where we were at that point in time. I did look back at in some of the communication, and I know there was a survey that was filled out by some folks related to the board in 2015. There's been various levels of communication, but in terms of plus Delta. I'm sure hindsight being 2020, there's many ways how we communicated, not just with jurisdictions, but with the public.
Okay, thanks, both of you. I had a follow-up question, a separate question, and that is, with the ASPPB Model Act, you're looking at accredited programs, but you're not looking specifically at APA COA accredited programs. And I'm wondering, why is PCSAS not included in that, which is also a nationally accredited program alongside COA?
I think I can't speak to why PCSAS is not. I think how's this? Okay, if I look directly at you, it looks like I can do this. So I think the bulk of the candidates are from APA and CPA accredited programs, so that was one reason. And then it also fit in line with the Model Act. But as it's my understanding that all the PCSAS programs are also APA accredited, at least at this point in time.
You're right, they are at this point in time. There's some discussion about people breaking away from APA and using just PCSAS accreditation.
Right.
And a number of them are the California schools. I want to make sure people know that.
Okay.
Since they're both recognized by the Department of Education, I would hope that they would be considered equally.
Okay. I'll bring that feedback back. This seems to work much better. Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, and my understanding, and this is probably the next agenda item, is that based on the letter that was in response to our letter, that individual jurisdictions can modify that eligibility to take that. So while ASPPB may not itself in its current form take non-APA, individual jurisdictions can make their own reg changes to allow for that.
Absolutely.
So I think if that's a next item question for discussion, but I just wanted to raise that as a possibility as well.
And I think that was a concern that was brought last time we met, is that there were a number of students that are not coming from accredited programs, particularly in California. And so if that's a route that you all would like to go, I'm personally an advocate for that, because I think it's logical, and again, as a student, I would absolutely want to take it at that point.
And if I could just add, I think it is helpful that there's a way to potentially get around this issue, but that, for the record, PCSAS is an accreditation body, and according to this Model Act, it says that the applicants need to be trained in an accredited program. And presently, PCSAS is recognized by APIC and also by the VA system, which I think hires more psychologists, I believe, than any other entity. So I think it's important to consider PCSAS.
Okay.
Can I just ask a follow-up question as well? When you said that the bulk of candidates who take the EPPP are from APA accredited programs, do you know what percentage?
I don't have that in front of me, but if you look at our doctoral program report, you can see, and I would be guessing at this point, but
yeah, I did look. I didn't want to count them all, by hand. And
there's a non-accredited tab, and so you can see the total numbers in the non-accredited tab, and but I don't recall what it is, but it's the vast majority.
Okay. And then just one other, the number, or the percentage or number of students from California who take the EPPP, I mean, do you know what percentage that is in terms of the overall country?
I don't know the exact percentage, but I think there is an awful lot. It's probably the largest in terms of EPPP exams.
So the largest number of people who take the test come from California?
Correct.
Okay.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Considering that the rollout for this is about a year and a half away, right?
Right.
What plans do you have for releasing training materials and things for students to prepare?
We will have, we don't do training materials as of right now for the EPPP, but we do plan to have practice items and things of that nature, a sample exam so that people, one, can see what types of content is on there, but more importantly, the types of the format of the questions, because they're going to look a little bit different.
Do you have a plan for rolling that out? Like, do you know when that would occur?
That'll happen sometime next year.
I could just ask a bit more about the rollout. I know this was discussed to a certain degree last time. My understanding is that in terms of preparing the exam, compiling the exam, putting it together, that there is a strong emphasis on content validity.
Mm-hmm.
We touched a bit last time on predictive validity and to what extent that might be there or not, but there are some basic psychometric properties that I'm wondering about, how that's going to be addressed between now and January 2020. Test, retest, reliability. I mean, I could go through the whole list, but I think what
Right.
I wonder most about is discriminant and validity. I think last time it was noted that the expectation is about 95% of students are going to pass EPPP2 because they've already passed EPPP1. And just in terms of, as people have already talked about, the costs and just the burden that's going to place on the students and so on, I'm just wondering, when as you're putting together this test, which I think is a very important one, we certainly want something like that in place in terms of preparing our students, protecting the public, and so on. But I wonder about the test itself, and to what extent attention might be devoted to other aspects of the validity and reliability of the measure beyond just content validity.
Right.
And in terms of how does it compare to other skills tests and the like.
Yeah, and I think we talked quite a bit about this at the last meeting. But things like predictive validity, I'll refer you, and I can send this to you, an article on Kane, and by Kane, it was in 1982, and so this discussion has been going on, I guess, since that point, but it really hasn't been refuted, and essentially that the model for licensure exams is to establish content validity. What is that minimum criteria that that is required? So I've looked to, we're psychologists, so obviously that doesn't really gel with our frame of thinking. But no, I mean, the EPPP is built on the same process, and every other licensure exam is as well. So in terms of hard data, and I bring that up because I tried to find a predictive validity study that was done on licensure exams. I have not been able to find one other than what does GRE predict in terms of another licensure exam. I've found some studies on that. But in terms of hard data, when we launch the exam, well, one of the things we're going to do is we're doing 2 beta tests. The first is more to get information on timing. Some of these exam items are different. We don't know how long they'll take the average test taker, so it'll give us information on how long it takes folks to get through it. Some psychometric data, but also anecdotal information on how people are reacting to the exam itself. But we just did this with the psychopharmacology exam, and the process is to launch the exam with candidates, and this is your beta test. There's a delayed score, and up until 3 years ago, there was a delayed score on the EPPP as it is now. And now we're so used to getting the score right at the center, which is great. But the data is collected on each item from the test takers that are taking the exam. That is then brought back. The items that work comprise a final form. That's brought to what's called the standard setting committee, and they review it, and it's mostly early career psychologists, and they provide a rating on each one of the items on the exam, which then sets your cut score. But I have difficulty talking about this because we go back and forth on the predictive validity, because as psychologists it makes sense, and we want to build an exam that way. But the most appropriate way to build an exam of this nature is to identify that content and make sure that it's set appropriately.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I guess I'm still wondering though, in terms of what's the sort of added value, other than the sort of the obvious face validity of, you know, the EPPP Part 2,
Right.
relative to EPPP Part 1, and to the extent that now we're asking students to
Right.
take two separate tests,
Sure.
you know, and if there is going to be this process of reviewing the, you know, how effective Part 2 is,
Right.
I'm wondering about, you know, the possibility of integrating it with Part 1, and, you know, checking that out, or, you know, trying to downsize potentially Part 1, since there is now also a Part 2.
Well, we did discuss that, and I think I alluded to it in the responses here, is the way we determined how to do this was to do a job task analysis. And when you look at the knowledge and the skills, it becomes pretty burdensome. And so that's why the length of the exam is requires 2 parts at this point in time. The added value, I think, is that the skills piece just hasn't been assessed nationally. There may be some jurisdictions that are doing it in their own way through their oral exams. I understand California used to do an oral exam, but clearly that's not being assessed. And I think just coincidentally, in the last TEP that came out, there was an article about this, about students' perceptions of their peers and competency. And you know, many students identified or indicated that some of their peers weren't, they didn't feel were competent. So this is a kind of a piece of where our field has been going for quite some time, into this competency movement. So the added value is really assessing something that hasn't been assessed.
Yeah, no, I as I said initially, I completely agree about the value of it. I guess I'm having some trouble still with the implementation in terms of how to assess the skills component, and wondering, you know, you're saying, well, we have EPPP Part 1, and it sounds like that it's not feasible to try to think about, now that there's an EPPP Part 2, how could the two perhaps be integrated, right, where you're basically able to assess perhaps some aspects of one using
Right.
two somehow, so that the two combined might be more effective than having two large separate tests.
Right, and that was, again, that was all based on the job task analysis essentially guided that decision, and that there was X number of knowledge pieces that psychologists said needed to be assessed, X number of skills pieces that psychologists said needed to be assessed, and based on that, it became a long and lengthy assessment process. I see the point, and I get what you're saying, but that's really why the decision was made.
I'm just going to ask one last follow-up question
sure.
on this one. I'm wondering, so if someone fails, the 5% that we're expecting that might fail the EPPP Part
Right.
2, I'm just wondering, how would you explain that? What would be the interpretation of, you know, where that individual is at? Does that mean that if they take, let's say, a prep course, and of course there could be different types of prep courses, so one could be very much skills-based, in which case then hopefully they've acquired the skills that they didn't have previously, they retake Part 2 and they pass, or someone could take a prep course that is simply helping them to pass an exam. And I'm just wondering, you know, what's your perspective on that as far as assessing skill?
Well, certainly I think there are people who are better test takers, so that's obviously an inherent fact of testing. So a test is a test. It's not perfect, but the idea behind the exam is very similar to the exam as it's constructed now, is that this is that minimum that we feel comfortable as a licensing body to allow this person at entry-level practice. And so if someone can learn those skills through a test prep company or through some remediation of some sort, then they were able to demonstrate that they have that minimum applied knowledge. So that's how I would interpret it, and I think that's how we interpret the EPPP now. It's just like a driver's license. You demonstrated that you have X amount of knowledge on the rules of the road.
I just wanted to invite Ms. Tracy Montez as well. She's the head of the Office of Professional Examination Services in California. Welcome.
Welcome. Am I on? Yes? Okay. So again, I'm still struggling a little bit of process.
We're having trouble hearing you. Sorry.
How about this one? No? Better?
You have to get real close to it.
Both of them. Okay, I'll try to talk louder.
That's
Is
better.
this working? Okay. So, if I heard an earlier comment, you're expecting about 95% to pass the EPPP2 test.
Well, I think we talked about that, and that is a guess, but I don't know that to be true.
And I know we sometimes make estimates. So for me, I would say that's an awfully high pass rate. Why are we having an exam? My other question is, if this is testing the skills portion, what has happened between the knowledge part? I mean, you're telling me there's a gap in how the skills are measured on the exam, but yet 95% are going to pass that second exam. So that would tell me that there's not a problem with skills being developed in the internship. So to me, that rationale is confusing. You need a skills test because people aren't being measured on skills, but yet you're expecting them to pass at 95%. And then I still am struggling with this written test being more of a knowledge final exam. Isn't that what the schools and the program should be doing? I mean, why is there so much reliance on prep courses? Why are we paying money to go get our education and our degrees, and then we have to rely on a test prep course to get us through the exam? That tells me there's something with the exam process. For example, BBS, we do have a knowledge test that's given earlier, law and ethics, and trying to reduce barriers to licensure and get folks licensed. They have their degree requirements, and then they take their law and ethics test, which is a knowledge-based test. And the passing standard is different. There's a different set of expectation, and then they get their supervised hours, and then we have a clinical exam. So instead of doing the oral exam, which we found had some reliability issues, we created scenario-based questions in the written test. So that's how we've addressed that. So I certainly understand the need to assess students and get them out into the occupation and get them through the process. But again, I'm just struggling with the fundamental rationale on this written test versus the skills test. And I certainly, again, agree that you've done an occupational analysis or job analysis and you've got the skill and the knowledge statements. I think that that's great to support the content validity. And that's, again, what a licensing test is about. We'd love to do predictive validity studies. We just don't have the ability to do that or resources and so forth. But again, I would argue you could develop some clinically based skills type questions on your multiple choice test. We're doing that with behavioral sciences with their professions right now, and so there are other options. So I think that, to sum this up, I think the task force is asking really good questions, and regardless of the decision that's made, I think that the board overall really needs to keep its options open, because it sounds like the association is going to move forward with this. It's something that they have some data and some support for, which I think is good. But I think we really need to look in the long term of how this is going to impact the profession and what it's going to do with being able to help consumers and patients in the long run and the costs, because this is going to be very costly.
Dr. Montez, I have a question for the next agenda item. So will you be here for
Yes.
the next? Okay, perfect.
There were a couple of things that you said, so I'll try to remember. In terms of the 95% pass rate, that was speculation, but there are other licensure exams that have similar pass rates, and I think for example, the physician's assistants, as I understand, is about a 95% pass rate, so I think my point to that is that there's 5% of the folks that perhaps are not prepared. I think you had said something else. In terms of the prep companies, I do think that a lot of students do that. I do know that we did a study where it didn't seem to matter whether or not someone used a prep course or not a prep course. What seemed to matter is the amount of time that they prepared for it. The overall pass rates for the EPPP right now are 73% for all test takers on first-time pass rates. In bringing it forward, that to me just seemed that's in line with what other professions do, and it also seems more appropriate. So that's all I was going to say related to that, because I think we made a statement that everyone has to go use a test prep company, and I think a lot of people do, but I don't know that that is absolutely required.
Going back to the letter that ASPPB sent, you mentioned the question of delayed implementation. The response from the ASPPB board was that that in most jurisdictions there does not appear to be a need for a change in regulations.
Right.
What I did find interesting, however, in the responses were that New York mentioned that 1/3 of the association membership would need substantial revisions, and while that's not most jurisdictions, certainly sizable, and on further review, it looks like the jurisdictions that would need to make those changes would be New York, Texas, and California, and which happen to be the largest share of psychologists. So while it's only 3 jurisdictions, as a proportion of registered psychologists, it is significant. And so I would be interested in hearing more about this delayed implementation consideration, because I think it comes off as a bit dismissive to say that most jurisdictions can go forward, but the majority of the licensees are in 3 states that do need to make those changes. So what process is in place for consideration if delayed implementation is needed for the largest jurisdictions?
Well, right now, and I talked to Antoinette prior to the meeting, we are reaching out personally to all the jurisdictions, so I know that she'll get a phone call, and looking at what is the timeline for any kind of regulatory changes. So obviously, in talking with Antoinette, it sounds like it's about 2 years. So I can't speak for the board, but I think that's something that we would have to certainly consider. So I know that these discussions are going on right now, and certainly based on everybody's feedback, that there may be some alterations to how this is rolled out. Yep.
Dr. Marcel?
Yes, just to go back to that first question that the task force asked about what were the factors that led to the decision to create 2 separate exams. And I apologize, I missed the first task force meeting, so this may have been addressed then, but in the ASPBB's communications with the different jurisdictions, are there problems with the current testing procedure? I mean, are there a large number of complaints due to lack of competency that this second exam would correct for or screen out?
Right.
I mean, I understand the job task analysis and the issue of competency. I'm just curious if there have been, a significant number of consumer complaints with the current testing system that has caused ASPPB and the licensing jurisdictions to feel that an additional test for competency would reduce those and improve consumer protection.
Right. We did talk about this last time, but it's not, you can't really base it on complaints because the base rate's pretty low, but essentially this was born through the whole competency movement. We've moved to some of that in the accreditation process, some of it in the applications. And it was really based off of a need of what isn't being assessed now. So the EPPP as it is right now is a knowledge-based exam, and it's been doing a fine job of that for 50-something years. And we referenced this article, I think Dr. Rodolfo talked about this. There was an article called Where Are the Other 90%? And the idea was that what licensing boards were relying on for that skills piece is supervisor ratings. However, often what they receive is this person's in the top 10%. So if everybody's in the top 10%, where are the other 90%? So I think we knew that as a field that was an area that was not being assessed. It wasn't based on a larger number of complaints. It was just based on kind of a culmination of this competency movement.
So the implication being that with a low base rate of complaints, that psychologists, as they're currently assessed, are competent, or the majority of them are competent.
You could make that assumption, but I don't believe that most clients would. I think grossly speaking, they may know if their psychologist is not competent.
I'm just speaking in terms of complaints that are filed with the jurisdictions. And speaking as a supervisor, I don't approve everybody or rate everybody in the top 10%. So, I mean, we're all trained and are supposed to take continuing education in supervision skills, prior to doing so. Okay, thank you.
Well, I applaud that.
Can I follow up along those lines? So I think this is kind of trying to combine both what Dr. Marcel and Dr. E. Bradbury were addressing. Is there, it's clearly well established why the move to competencies. It sounds like a great opportunity to actually test that. So in many ways, I'm actually really compelled by the number 2 test. But I'm wondering, is there going to be any movement forward to get rid of number 1? If we really as a field are moving toward competency, this is a way of assessing skills in a much more perhaps valid kind of way. Is there a way that we could actually think about reducing, kind of move, as was kind of said before, it's really, I get why, given the job analysis and all of that, the test has to be so big.
Sure.
And arguing that it's 1 test in 2 parts, I think it's going to feel like 2 tests.
Right.
But is there an opportunity or is there a way to look forward to put more of our eggs in the number 2 basket and get rid of number 1?
Right. There hasn't been discussion of that right now. I have heard that, and I think the way that the test is being constructed now is that competency is really 2 pieces. There's your general foundational knowledge and then more applied knowledge or skills. So taking away 1 is essentially assessing skills but not foundational knowledge. So I have heard this, and I get that it certainly makes sense in terms of reducing barriers, but as based on the competency model that we have now, that's not a plan.
I think just to kind of say, opportunity to encourage the continued kind of analysis to see what do we get for 1 versus 2,
right.
How to compare them, the discriminant validity, that if we really are in a place where, again, I understand what you're saying in terms of replacing 1 versus the other, but really the attention that I want to pay to is the kind of tremendous barriers, while also paying attention to, we've got a gatekeeping opportunity, but if we're really at the place of, and we'll see whether or not 95% really pass or not, I'm just wondering whether or not there can be considered a conversation about perhaps reducing the size of number 1 or right. Tagging on piece of number 1 to number 2, but anything that can really be done, because I am really quite concerned that this is going to continue to pose a significant barrier while we're in a place where we need more and more psychologists to address consumer needs.
A fair comment. I'll bring that back. Yeah. Right. So would now be a good time for me to bring up the part 3? Too soon? Too soon.
I have a question about the skills statements, the 71 skills statements. Are all of those new, or were any of them part of the previous exam plan or
Right.
blueprint?
No, it was created independently, so based on, again, through the job task analysis. Now, assessment and intervention, the global label is similar. That's a big piece of what psychologists do, but and I do have some sample items I'll send to the group after we leave, but I think it gives you a feel for how this looks a little bit different if you recall the EPPP itself, but it's very applied and it has scenarios with exhibits, and so you may have a test protocol or an interview or an added statement for that scenario to build off of, but it looks very different.
Were these skills developed in anticipation of possibly having a second test?
The first job task analysis that added competency was in 2009, and then they've refined those competency pieces, or skills pieces, over time, and they did another job task analysis more recently. If it was 2014, I think. So again, the idea was to better assess what we were assessing there, but the idea was not necessarily 2 tests, but based on all the information that these 2 parts evolved.
I just wanted to kind of echo a couple of comments, which was, I wanted to echo some of the comments and add that I know you're expecting 95% of people who passed part 1 to pass part 2. It's like an expected kind of, like, it's not, we'll see the results when it happens, but that's kind of the expectations. I'm just kind of wondering, does it also not imply that, because there's a good correlation right there, that part 1, which is knowledge-based, is actually correlated with high skills. People who are passing part 1 do have the skills, if that's what you're expecting already. So I was just sort of confused about, again, the necessity of it if there's already this expectation that people who pass part 1 will pass part 2.
Yeah, and I think the 95% was something that Dr. Rodolfo and I just threw out. We really don't know. It'll be based on the standard setting meeting. I assumed that it would be higher than the knowledge statement. One, for the reason that you said, is some of the folks may have the knowledge and the skills, but also it's global, and a skills exam is probably one that is going to require less preparation, memorization, because you've got those skills, or you don't. Maybe that 95% shouldn't have been thrown out, but that wasn't a committee statement. I think that was my statement or Dr. Rodolfo's. But I do think it will be a higher rate than the EPPP, just as it is skills based and it is general.
So sorry, were you gonna go? Okay. So it sounds like you're, collecting data, as you're implementing part 2. But I'm wondering, so with the January 2020 sort of deadline or launch date, is the idea that that's when students or candidates will be able to start taking EPPP Part 2, but it won't be considered fully implemented just yet because you're continuing to gather data on how viable of a measure it is, and that there will actually be, perhaps a lag of several years before it's fully adopted?
So let me talk a little bit more about that. And we just did this with the psychopharmacology exam. So given the number of candidates that take the EPPP, it wouldn't take very long to get sufficient numbers to have data on a form of the EPPP. So it's almost like years and years ago, the EPPP was done this way every time. You would develop a form, people would take it, they would scale it down based on the performance, throw out bad items, and then derive a score. And that score is off of the standard setting meeting. So how this would work is if January 2020, those folks that are taking that exam, let's say there was a month, I'm just throwing out a number, I don't know exactly how long it'll be. That allows data to be collected, also allows time to put together a standard setting committee. So that data is based on the performance of candidates taking the exam. I don't know if that clarifies or not. So there's, the way that EPPP is now, that data is ongoing, but at one point it had to be the first time, and that's exactly how it was done.
Okay, thank you. That does clarify it. I guess from a sort of a consumer perspective, I would feel more comfortable, for instance, knowing that, let's say the first time it's launched, that we then see, and let's say it's, the pass rate, I'm just going to make this up, I know it's absurd. Okay, but 99% of the people pass.
Sure.
So, so then I'm going to be wondering, well, where's the utility?
Right.
Maybe some adjustments need to be made to Part 2 because it's overlapping potentially too much or correlating too highly with performance on Part 1. So I just wondered, it feels like we're going from sort of preparing and developing the exam to fully adopting it without data, basically to support that we should be moving forward with the exam.
Data being pass rates? Is that what you'd like to
or
say?
not just pass rate, or other aspects of the exam that could emerge after the first time that it's administered broadly.
Sure.
And it's great that you're going to have a lot of data.
Right.
But it would be helpful if that data was clear to the public and to the educators that the data were being used to inform, full implementation of Part 2.
Right. Well, we will be gathering some data on our initial beta testing, that'll be next year sometime, and that's just a practice run. We'll get some initial psychometric data on that, but the launch is when you get your item level data. And obviously your pass rate, but you can't say the pass rate until that happens. You're right.
Elaborate a little bit more on the beta processing that's going to occur. Is it going to include the people who are sitting for the EPPP Part 1?
The initial beta testing is probably going to be newly licensed individuals, and because they're closest to that point. So we can get some initial information on how they do. It's not a true beta test because there's the incentive to complete a multi-hour exam is questionable. But it will give us anecdotal information. It also gives information on timing of items and feedback on just the format itself.
Just to kind of add on that to make sure that the beta pool is diverse.
Oh, absolutely.
That way it captures everyone, and to make sure that California has participants.
Right, of course.
It seems like this, in spite of the letter, there's still ongoing questions about the same questions that we ask, and on the letter it says that you're continue to talk about this with the board of directors, and and there's going to be further communication with regards to the
Right.
letter we submitted, and it will be good to have follow up on the same things that have been brought up, including the costs, like lowering the cost. So any updates on that will be very helpful for us.
Sure.
And delayed implementation concerns, given that California has the 2-year process, and as well as applicability to the needs of member jurisdiction, which in this case will be California in terms of utility and all that. So I think this is a good time to take a short break, and then afterwards we're going to resume to ask for public comments and some more questions. So let's take a 10-minute break. Thank
Okay.
you. We'll get started with public comments. Do you have any public comments? Okay.
Is it okay, even though I'm not public? I was just curious. I may be sort of misreading. So there was this handout included that it looks like it's a survey that was sent to various state and provincial licensing boards. And as I look through it, it seems to me that I counted quickly. I think there's 27 respondents, and it looks like only 3 are saying that a student could be eligible for taking the EPPP sort of prior to receiving their degree, that it's based solely on coursework. There's, and it looks like Manitoba, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. And then there's about 5 where they're saying, well, prior to completion of their supervised professional experience. And I can't tell if they mean the postdoctoral supervised professional experience or predoctoral. But even if we sort of assume that they're talking about predoctoral, then that still leaves, at least of these respondents, what is that? My math is off a little. About 19 programs where it looks like you have to have your degree, your graduate degree, before you can sit for the EPPP. So I'm just not clear on how to interpret, if I'm reading this table correctly, this information relative to the ASPPB's response that it's most jurisdictions won't have to change their rules and regulations.
Right. I think most of the jurisdictions, because of the wording of their regulations, they actually don't have to change their regulations. This survey, this is what states allow for the EPPP currently before supervised practice experience. What are currently doing that model? Very few are doing that model, although there are quite a few programs, I believe, that are circumventing that by having students take it in a supervised practice state. So, for example, in Texas, there's a supervised practice license, so they can take the exam at essentially the master's level, and so by applying in one of those states, students at the doctoral level can actually take it a little bit earlier.
Any public comments regarding agenda number 5? Green.
Yes, hi. I'm Dr. Joe Lindercore. I'm the CEO of the California Psychological Association. I just had a couple of points that I would like clarification on. One is just going back to this handout. And can someone explain again why California is not on this list? Did California not provide information?
The inquiry actually came from us, and this was the data that we collected
you were asking
from
these.
Yeah,
Got it.
We
Okay.
sent the question to the listserv about early eligibility because we wanted to know for creation of the different options that the task force will be discussing today about whether or not someone could take the part one at the end of their coursework,
I
and
see.
then
Okay.
who else had that current setup. So we were just gathering
Okay,
that
so it's information for this group. Okay. And then just going back to an earlier comment when you were talking about the minutes, just in terms of process, I want to be sure that I'm understanding that this is a task force, that this task force will then ultimately make a recommendation to the full board about whether addressing the question of whether or not the Board of Psychology in California wishes to adopt the EPPP, or I guess better way to say it, continue to use the EPPP as a criterion for licensure. Am I right?
Yeah, so basically the goal of this task force is to make a recommendation to the full board for August meeting, and then at that point the full board will decide to so it's up to the full board to decide to approve or make amendments to the recommendation of the task force.
So if the Board of Psychology decides to continue to use the EPPP, then it is required that both parts be administered. That I'm right about that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. And if the board, and in that case, there is no need for a statutory change, correct? Right.
There is a need based on item number 7 if we go down that route. There's some draft language for item number 7 that the task force is looking at later today because there are potential regulatory changes that would need to be made.
Okay. So in either case, there's going to have to be a regulatory change, whether you move to continue to use the EPPP or whether you choose to do something other than that. But the Board of Psychology in California has the option to earlier points, even though ASPPB has already said that the EPPP will be 2 parts. The Board of Psychology in California has the option to make a decision about whether or not to do that. Okay, thank you.
Can I just one quick question? I mean, and I don't necessarily expect you to have the answer for it, but if California, the Board of Psychology decides not to continue to use the EPPP, and seeing that the bulk of the test takers, the EPPP, come from California, would ASPPB implement this in the other states around the country?
Yeah, my understanding is that the plan, we are reviewing rollout options, but as of right now, the plan, the exam will be ready in 2020 and we will roll it out.
Even if California decides not to use it?
That's my understanding.
And just a kind of contextual point of clarification, if the board were to agree not to use the EPPP, that would mean that we would have to come up with our own examination, which would then not be able to be portable with other states that adopted the EPPP. So I just want to put that out for kind of added clarification. And we would have to have that ready by January 1, 2020.
And can I just a follow-up question? When you say that it's unportable, you're assuming that the other jurisdictions would not accept California's license. They would require anyone who moves from California to another state to take the EPPP 1 and 2?
I I would assume that in order to have a portable license and to meet the eligibility requirements for other states, if another state was to require the EPPP, that would be a requirement for licensure if they did not accept the state exam for California.
And I'm just wondering, is there an intermediate step where perhaps California doesn't commit to fully adopting the new EPPP, but would like to wait for more additional information about it, following beta testing and following the actual implementation, if that is in January 2020, just to have more information about what we're adopting?
So I wish I had a direct answer for that. All I can say is that the board is reviewing all options. So how this is rolled out may change, and I hope to have an answer by October. So I think that is potentially possible. But like I said, I wish I had I can't speak for the board. I just know that they are reviewing alternative options.
Okay. Mr. Fu?
I think as a follow-up question, may I ask Dr. Montez a question? Could you speak more about the auditing work that your office does with relation to the EPPP and what that looks like? And once that audit is complete or when it occurs, what does that audit actually mean for us in terms of information and how we look at that?
So the audit is just an extensive evaluation of the examination program that starts with looking at the job analysis and how once the job analysis is done, the examination outline is used to develop test items. It looks at the passing score process, how the exam's administered, security, and so forth. So it's a very extensive study looking at the process to make sure that it meets national testing standards, as well as being fit for California. Is it measuring those important competencies and so forth? So it does look at data and statistics and give lots of information for the board to consider in terms of its suitability. And so really, I think, where you're at right now is, and I was discussing this earlier, is that the association has done their due diligence in terms of completing the job analysis and identifying evidence to support this new exam component. And they're taking all of the steps that they've done to develop the EPPP1. They're applying those same standards and protocols. And so the intent is that the exam should be valid, reliable, and fair. And then as they beta test, they're going to get some statistics that should confirm that all the steps done ahead of time support the test. And then what will happen is you'll start to see, pass rates and get a sense of how it's truly performing. And then again, that's where I think the board would want to step back and, potentially, consider how this is impacting the candidate pool and so forth. I think it might be hard to have the board participate partially. I think it's really going to be all or none because of the way regulations are set and transportability and things like that. And as Ms. Sorick pointed out, to have another exam in place would be very challenging. But I think that certainly the option is to say, well, we're going to monitor this. You may decide that transportability and being part of the national picture is very important, but also recognizing that having the most licensees and being a very diverse state is that this is a concern, and that you may ask for OPS to do another audit, or maybe not necessarily a full audit, but more of a study of how these two exams are impacting your candidate pool. So sorry, I'm probably giving you again more information than you want, but I think this is a very challenging decision.
And that's really helpful. And as a follow-up question, typically how many years of data would you need to conduct an audit that is meaningful?
It depends on how many administrations are given and kind of the cycle, but you're going to need at least 2 to 3. I'd have to again look at the graduation rates and that sort of thing, but normally when you roll out a new exam program, your pass rate is low because it's new. Candidates are learning about it, they're getting comfortable with the process, and that does impact the pass rate. And then as the program has been out for time, it kind of levels off, and then you get a true sense. But they will be able to look at item statistics and, get some sense of how the items are performing, and then, again, overall picture of the pass rate. But it does take some time.
And one last question, hopefully. Are there examples in recent memory where after the audit process, a consumer board has determined that the national exam doesn't meet the needs of protecting California's consumers, and then have gone on to either develop their own exam or work with other jurisdictions to address the, not a failed audit, but to address the audit recommendations?
Yeah, I can give you, again, some examples. The Board of Behavioral Sciences, do a lot of work with them. They, once upon a time, I want to say early 90s maybe, they participated in the National Social Work exam. They used the national, and there were problems that came up in the audit. A very high pass rate, protocols were not being followed, so the board elected to leave that program and have a state exam. And then over time, the national made some changes to their program and continued to court California BBS. And so I think it was last year, Amy can help me here, approximately the board through an audit process decided, okay, the national has improved their process, again, in support of transportability and so forth. We are going to utilize the national, and that's part of their new exam program with the law and ethics earlier and using the national. I will tell you though that there was a negotiation that went on. There were okay, your exam meets national testing standards, but in California, it's not just the minimum. We have higher expectations for transparency and various things, and so we had to work with the board and the National Association to negotiate certain parameters. Then on the flip side, we have the National Association for Marriage and Family Therapists, and they have continued to court the board, and through audits, the board has determined, no, it's just not. I mean, when you have the majority of marriage and family therapists licensed here in California, the way it's practiced outside doesn't make sense. So those are a couple of examples. But again, the key thing, and your board has always been very good about this, is doing your occupational or job analysis, doing your evaluations or audits of the national program, and having these kinds of conversations. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was very informative. It seems like all of the questions are going towards the scenario and less about the letter. So we're gonna move on to agenda number 6. And yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
Okay,
Dr.
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
And definitely, like the follow up will keep the conversation going because we're still invested on as you've noticed, we have an hour of questions and still unclear. Okay, so I would like to invite Ms. Snyder to go over some of the scenarios.
So while they're getting that set up, I just wanted to give you guys an overview of the handout. So at the last meeting, Mr. Fu requested a diagram of each possible option available to the board in implementing the EPPP Part 2 exam. So attachment A, if you're looking at attachment A right now, that's just the overview of the current examination qualification for the EPPP. That's how we're doing it now. So attachment B, option 1, provides you an overview of the examination process as of January 1st, 2020, without changes to the regulations. This option would prevent pre-degree application to ASPPB and the possibility that examination results for applicants who have taken the EPPP Part 1 in another state could be invalidated if it's taken prior to the degree completion. Attachment C is an overview of the EPPP examination process as of January 1st, 2020 with ASPPB pre-degree application. This option allows pre-degree application directly to ASPPB for students from APA programs who have completed all academic coursework. This creates an unfair licensing process and market disadvantage for students who are in non-APA approved programs, as it will extend the time frame for completion of all licensure requirements for non-APA students and delay non-APA students' ability to start practicing professionally and earning professional wages, thus extending the time they will need to be paying for the associated student loans. Attachment D is an overview of the EPPP examination process as of January 1st, 2020 with board pre-degree application. This option allows pre-degree application for all students, APA and non-APA programs. This process is the most equitable solution for all applicants that also preserve the board's ability to ensure all applicants meet the same eligibility standards without undue delay or denial. Given the current direction of ASPPB, it is the recommendation of staff that option 3 is the best solution available to the board and applicants at this time. So, and then of course attachment E just gives you a comparison of all the options. So if you'd like, we can look at each option and I can take you to show you the step-by-step process for each one. Bring up option 1. Diagram.
Okay. I'm sorry, can I ask a quick question? I apologize, I wasn't here before. So this assumes moving forward. That vote has already been, that's already, or this is information to help us decide?
That's correct. This is, first of all, I just want to thank Ms. Snyder for pulling together these diagrams. I'm a visual person, and
Very
being
helpful.
able to see this laid out is really helpful. So really, thank you to you and to the board staff for doing it that way. And when originally I made the ask, it was for us to think through what this would look like if we were to move forward. It was not that we had moved forward. It was that we wanted to see what were the options available and what the impacts would be on our potential candidates taking the exam. And so Ms. Schneider and the board staff has laid out these 3 diagrams for us to review and discuss. And so that's the reasoning behind that.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Okay, so option 1. So the first step is for an applicant to submit an application for licensure and pay the application fee of $40. Okay, from there, staff has to determine the eligibility for those candidates. They have to look at their doctoral degree and 1,500 hours of supervised professional experience. If they're approved, okay, their eligibility is sent to ASPPB electronically to take the EPPP Part 1. Applicants can schedule their exam directly with ASPPB. If they pass, okay, they can go directly to ASPPB to schedule their exam and take the EPPP Part 2. If they pass that exam, then they can apply to the board to take the CPLEE examination. Now, for this particular option, we would probably have to change regulations to allow out-of-state applicants, because we're not sure if we can accept out-of-state applicants who take the exam without applying to the board. And have any questions? So, option 2. Okay. This one allows pre-degree application with ASPPB. So students who actually have completion of their academic coursework and they're APA qualified, they come from an APA qualified school, then they can apply directly to ASPPB. Okay. So if they pass that EPPP Part 1, then they can apply to the board to take the EPPP Part 2. To qualify for that exam, they would have to submit their doctoral degree and have 1,500 hours of supervised professional experience. If they're approved for that exam, then their eligibility is then reported to ASPPB. They can then schedule to take their exam. If they pass the EPPP Part 2, then they can apply for the CPLE, the state exam, and finish their licensure process. And just to add, when they apply directly to ASPPB for the EPPP Part 1, this is the section where we would have to amend our regulations to allow this process.
Have any clarification? For an option 2, there is no pathway for licensure for someone from a regionally accredited program. They have to be an APA accredited program. That's correct? Okay.
That is correct. Option 3. Okay. So this is an overview of the EPPP examination process as of January 1st, 2020 with board pre-degree application. So here you submit the application for licensure, and of course you pay the $40 application fee. This is where they can register, to qualify for the EPPP Part 1, applicants must complete all academic coursework, and this is where the board will have to amend regulations to allow pre-approval. If they are approved for the EPPP exam, then we send their eligibility to ASPPB. If they pass the EPPP, then they can submit their doctoral degree and 1,500 hours of supervised professional experience. If they are approved, then their eligibility is sent to ASPPB again, and they can schedule their exam to take the EPPP Part 2. Once they pass that exam, then they can apply for the CPLEE examination. Does anybody have any questions?
How much? I just have a question. I'm just curious, how much more work do you anticipate for the board to implement these? I guess there would be an additional step then. The board would have to approve candidates to take the EPPP1, then approve candidates for the EPPP2, and then to take the CLP, LEE.
Well, it's the way the application process works right now is that they have to submit one application. So once they submit that application, we would just be reviewing their academic coursework, and then and then make sure that that they're coming from an accredited or an approved academic institution. And then from there, they would, and then, so I don't think it's an additional work for us because right now we just submit they submit just one application.
So most of the work is done right up front,
Right.
that first thing. Okay.
Right.
Hello. May I add to the process? So if the task force were to recommend some changes, of course, to any of the options, so I think what's the best way is we would amend our process also. So just to be coherent, because right now the current process, as Ms. Snyder said, we only have one application, so it might not work well with the new options available. So we will probably make some adjustment. And like any rules change, the initial probably gonna have an increase. So and then I'm sure if we were to go that route, the board will come up with some complementary process to help with the workload.
A clarifying question. For the secondary application step, that on option 3,
okay,
would there also be a fee attached to that and another?
Oh, there's only one
Okay.
application. So once somebody submits an application, that's it. I mean,
I also have a clarifying question. When it says that to excuse me, qualify for EPPP Part 1, applicants must complete all academic coursework. Who's defining what the required academic coursework is? Is that the board's decision or is that program decision?
we would have to amend our regulations to that. I'm not sure how we would.
That's
right. Typically, right now, we have a process kind of similar to verify completion of coursework. That's for the purpose of gaining experience. So right now, the current process, we will ask the student to contact their university of registrar and to write a letter on behalf of them stating that they have met the coursework requirements for their program on certain dates. So we can rely on that date to gain experience. So with regards to that question, so we probably will employ a similar strategy to help us deciding the meeting the coursework requirements.
Has met all the. So it would be the school telling us that they have met all the requirements, the academic coursework.
Okay, that's very helpful. I was just thinking of this in the context of my own program where the internship is required and there is a course number assigned to it, so that actually for some of our programs it seems like it's not possible for the student to take the exam prior to actually receiving their degree, which occurs after they've defended their dissertation and completed the internship. So I just wanted clarification on that.
A clarification and possible solution. I mean, whether or not you define it as coursework or not is for you internally to decide. And obviously, if you can not decide the internship experience as being coursework, that obviously will solve that solution problem. No, that was directed towards my colleague. I can't read her name, and she understood.
Anybody have any other questions?
Any other clarifying questions?
Just out of curiosity, do you know approximately? I mean, how many candidates there are currently each year to take the permission to take the EPPP?
I don't have those numbers, but
back to you on the statistics.
We can pull
I can
last
pull.
year's numbers for you.
Well, I'm just curious, but we're talking 600, 700?
Somewhere around there.
Okay.
I'd have to pull the numbers to know for sure.
1,591 between January and December of 2017
Okay,
at EPPP.
thank you.
Any other questions? Just one quick one. So this third option does allow for non-APA students to go through? Okay.
It's in my understanding that option 3 is recommended by the board staff because it allows for all students, including the ones that are out of state, as well as the ones that are not from APA or CPA accredited schools, to have an equal ability to pursue a license. Okay, so if there's no more clarifying questions, thank you, Ms. Snyder and Ms. Chung. What we can do now is we can put on a motion and start the discussion with regards to these options.
Madam Chair, for clarification, the motion would be on the premise of if we did adopt the EPPP exam going forward, this is the option we would take. But it's not necessarily committing us to the adoption of the EPPP, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's to discuss approval of motion, the motion to approve option 3.
Understood. Okay, so I'm happy to make the motion that we recommend to the board to adopt option 3 if the board also chooses to continue the EPPP exam.
That's a pretty good motion.
I second that motion.
Okay, so we can resume the discussion on the various options that were presented and any other comments.
Option 3, I think, is the best way forward, but there's some larger issues that maybe Matt could answer or possibly not, but because in terms of being accepted by licensed mobility is really important for everyone involved, so that our students or our psychologists can work in other states and the like. And the reality is that substantial that other licensing boards are still going to have to consider whether or not someone who passes the EPPP 1 and 2 are acceptable to licensure if they didn't go to one of the APA accredited schools. So that's a larger issue that is really concerning for me, is that we have them jump through all these hoops, and then what happens when a state says, well, yes, you did the EPPP 1 and 2 and you did great, but you didn't go to one of our to an APA accredited school, and therefore we're not going to recognize your license in our state. So I'm not sure how that can be. Has that been addressed, and what is then the response or the plan forward for issues like that?
So the question is really for portability in other jurisdictions. Is that what you're saying?
Right, because that's one of the reasons why we're trying to go to a single standard, isn't it?
Right. So my understanding is that there are several jurisdictions that require APA or CPA accreditation. I think the number is 12. And so that would be a stumbling block in those particular jurisdictions, regardless of all other, not just EPPP, but all areas. Most states have that requirement. but have a option of equivalency, something that can be proven through some kind of credential review to be equivalent to an APA program. So that'll be jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
CAPIC has already dealt with this in various jurisdictions where we didn't meet their formal standards, and so they come to me and they say, what is your standards? How do you implement it? How do you do quality assurance? And we've addressed it in about 6 different instances in the past few years in different states.
Just a question, in terms of the regulation changes that would have to occur with option 3, what does that look like? I'm not familiar with how the board has to go about that process.
That's the next agenda item, is that if there was option 3, if we proceed with the option 3 on the premise that we would continue with the EPPP, then we would then recommend, we would discuss and recommend as a task force what those regulatory changes would look like to the board on item 7.
But there was a comment earlier that that's a 2-year process, or did I misheard that? Okay.
I wanted to clarify something. So if it takes about up to 2 years to get the regulations set in motion for option 3, and obviously 2020 is just upon us pretty quickly, is there an option in between in terms of like what do we do in do we just go for option 1 at that point, like where students are not going to be eligible to take it early?
Just procedurally, there is an option. So there's 2 different phases of regulatory changes. There's an initial review phase that goes through our board with our legal counsel, the Department of Consumer Affairs, Department of Finance, and Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. Because of the implementation date, there is a possibility that we could request an urgent review to speed up the process. It's not a guarantee, but it's something that we can always ask for. So that's certainly something to consider. We put out 2 years because it has been taking about 2 years for programs to make regulatory changes with the 2 different parts. Second part being putting the notice out for public comment, having a regulatory hearing. If there is any amendments to the language, that has to go out for public comment as well. And then it goes to Office of Administrative Law, who looks at it from just a legal standard. Is it clarifying existing law? Is it repeating anything that's already in statute? Things of that nature. So they're not looking at the policy at the tail end of the game. They're just looking at it to make sure that the language reads correctly. I hope that answers kind of your question.
Partially, yes, and I think one thing that if I'm understanding you correctly, that it is that we can potentially expedite the process of just reviewing the policy and the language of the regulations. However, I think I'm kind of thinking more about the tail end of it, which is how does it impact a potential licensed psychologist when they have to take because obviously until option 3, if we adopt the EPPP, if option 3 goes into effect, I'm assuming it won't be by 2020 if the expedited review is not happening, right? If that doesn't happen. So in the meantime, does it mean that students who will not be eligible to take it before getting the degree conferred and the 1,500 hours of experience?
I'm not sure there's necessarily an answer to that, but we could always request with ASPBB as they're asking their member jurisdictions about timeline for implementation, if there are regulatory or statutory changes that need to be made, that we could say, this is what our process looks like. Could you consider a delayed implementation date? That's something that Given the number of applicants, we could always request that as well. So it could be twofold. We request a more efficient review for the regulatory changes, and then the second part, we could ask for a delayed implementation date to accommodate for that.
Historic, is it possible, if I recall, there is a one-pager with like the administrative regulatory process. Is it possible for the task force members to get a copy of it so they can just see what that looks like?
Yes.
Thank you.
For the visual ones.
Yes.
I guess during our lunch break, we'll have that available so everyone can get a copy. Thank you.
I mean, I think I'm stuck a few paces back, which is that given what Dr. Yee was raising, that there are a number of programs, especially large UC-based programs, where actually I'm stuck on this course kind of conversation. I don't know who I'm looking to. I'm just going to say it out loud. The course kind of issue is a problem in part because a course like either dissertation completion or internship as a course. So the required coursework thing may be another thing that's going to get might interrupt the ability for folks to actually do this within programs. And so just thinking, I'm part of a small program where we could just change whatever we want, but UC, I'm not so sure. And also other larger, other kind of programs that are perhaps larger, that this kind of issue about what is a course and what completion of coursework is actually might be quite problematic in terms of the feasibility of actually completing it within. So it sounds like I don't know where the opportunities are to change or to modify or to clarify what coursework means in the context of moving forward, as to whether or not that would be a regulatory piece on the board side, a clarification in terms of the ASPB side, or what happens at the university. But that's where I'm stuck, because I do think that it is actually going to be a problem for a number of schools. Is that coursework isn't just that I'm done with, history and systems. It's actually that I have to take internship as a course.
So this is at the next agenda item, but on page 27 of 29, lines 21 through 25, there is proposed language if we were to move forward with option 3 to your question. So I'm not sure if I should read it out loud at this time or if I should wait until then. I defer to the chair.
You can. Since it's relevant to the discussion right now, you can proceed.
So on lines 21 through 25 on page 27 of the combined packet, it says, an applicant is eligible to take the first part of the EPPP upon completion of all academic coursework of a qualifying doctorate degree. To satisfy this requirement, the applicant shall submit to the board a written certification from the registrar or training director of the educational institution or program stating that the applicant has completed all required academic coursework of a qualifying doctorate degree.
So I guess that's the point of clarification that we would have to ask some of our member schools as to whether or not that could count. So again, I would imagine in a large UC system, getting the registrar to actually change an indication of what is academic might be problematic. Again, I know our registrar, we got a tiny little school, we can write it up. But larger systems, I think that's actually going to be a problem because the academic, what does that constitute? So, and I think that place perhaps we could kind of finagle that in terms of internship, but dissertation maybe and maybe not so much. So I don't know, I would defer to the folks that are in part of these systems, but I do want to anticipate that might be a problem.
Yeah, I was just thinking this, I actually was stuck a bit there as well, trying to contemplate the impact on one's ability to practice psychology, get licensed in practice psychology. And we talked about it the previous time, that the timeline is just being pushed, and the response that we got is that, but we're going to allow for the first exam to be taken during like the third, second year during the grad school, and then the DCTs didn't have a good response, saying, well, then it's all on graduate school for them to pass, and the impact that it might or might not have on the internship application, what have you. But the discussion, I think, in fact, was around the possibility for the first exam, in fact, to be able to be taken while they're in grad school. And right now, the way that we're discussing and the way that it's written and the barriers possibly to change it within different institutions, for me, it's emerging as a variable, as a serious, strong variable.
May I just make a comment? I'm currently going through the internship process right now. So I know that I don't know how other people's programs go, but in my program, to go to internship, you need to meet all the course requirements. So I don't see that necessarily being a problem because you've already completed the coursework if you're going off to internship. I don't know how your program does it, but that's how mine does.
Actually, I think you're raising a very important point, because this could translate for those students that you would be taking the exam while on internship. Sorry, Olga,
Sorry,
I didn't
director of training at the internship site. Good luck with that.
Well, yes, good luck to you. That's why I was looking at you at the time. But it seems like there are implications there as well.
I also wonder how academic coursework is defined, how that'll actually impact students and their, I don't know if this is connected to things, but I'm just curious about their full-time status. So I'm assuming, because I know I was enrolled in internship coursework while on internship, and that made me a full-time student status, and that had an impact on my financial aid. So if we remove, and whether regardless or not, programs, I'm assuming small programs, large schools, small schools, all have a similar policy about making sure that students are enrolled full-time even when they're on internship. So I'm kind of curious about, if you use this language of completed academic coursework, how will that impact students' financial aid positions? That's kind of my...
A clarification on that, just to be helpful, maybe helpful. Different languages used for different purposes. The labor code uses certain language that sometimes means full-time, 32 hours a week. For the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, it's 30 hours a week. So you can use a certain term in some context that means one thing, and then in another context means something else. I think we should specify that, but it can be done in a way that addresses some of those needs.
This is a question for Dr. Turner. So the intention of the ASPPB board about allowing only the APA certified with relation to the academic coursework, what does that mean to the board itself? So what, just for informing our discussion, in your head, what does completing academic coursework mean? So that as we think through,
there are some logistical challenges in that, and so the way that we had defined it is because different programs have different requirements. So we were going to ask training directors just certify via a link that this student has met all academic coursework requirements, so that we're also getting transcripts as well, but the transcripts can vary from institution to institution.
What I sense from this conversation here is that I think we're struggling with the vagueness of what academic coursework means.
Right.
And it sounds like that the ASPPB board's response to that vagueness is to just let the training director decide what academic coursework means.
Well, we're going to get the transcript, so we'll have a certain number of hours. But there is some variability from programs, at least that's what we've been told from program directors, so that final arbiter is the training director. Now, if the transcript comes in, I don't recall what the number of hours are. If that's too low, then they wouldn't get past that first level. But it's a two-step process. In terms of regulations, I think it might get a little bit trickier.
Just to piggyback on that, I think if the training director is the authority, the person who's clicking the box rather than the office of registrar, I think then that would separate the financial aid, because I'm very much feeling everything that you're saying. If the office of registrar is not asked to provide that letter regarding coursework, but it is kept in the spirit that it was meant with the training director, we may be able to get around that particular.
Out of curiosity, would that, to your question about the larger institutions, how would, and would you have a sense of where that would be a possibility for your peers at other larger institutions with the like would they get pushed back from the training director to say, oh, you probably should go to the registrar, or I may not be able to sign that? What are your sense of that?
In terms of the training directors being willing to, in my experience at a larger institution, it is much easier to get your training director to approve something than to go through the whole red tape of an office of registrar and getting the right person to sign the right letter in the right time frame. I would assume that my training director would feel more comfortable, because then he would be able to really be a decider essentially for our program, and then that would keep some of that autonomy within our own program rather than just having it be a random point where the state has decided that by the time you hit either this number of hours or this amount of coursework, you're done.
So in the current language that we read earlier, it does specify that the written certification can come from either the registrar or the training director. So either options are available in the current language as proposed if we were to go with option 3, which is the current item.
I would say, I would just want to add, as a training director, it actually puts us in a rather awkward position because we know the universities, what their perception is as far as, the required academic coursework. So to check a box saying that a student has passed all the coursework, we certainly want to support our students, and so the motivation is there. But we're operating within this larger system. So potentially, maybe the language could be changed to where the DCT feels that the student is eligible to take the exam, as opposed to saying that they've completed all academic coursework, because, by the book, that would not be the case. For some universities like mine, where the internship and the dissertation are associated with course numbers, and therefore the inference is coursework.
I was just going to ask what your response was to that.
I'm not a regulator, but I think that opens up a lot of ambiguity, and it depends on what your intent is with this. ASPBB's intent was that they had finished coursework, and so essentially it was just internship and supervised training at that point in time. That being said, as a jurisdiction, you can do whatever you like. Manitoba, as you saw on that list, they're already doing it during coursework. So from your office, what would be easiest to regulate and enforce and review, I think, is what you would probably want to do.
Just another comment that I received from one of our DCTs, runs our PsyD program. She expressed that in an APIC board discussion, there's some concern among training directors that internship sites may start requesting or requiring passes on the EPPP2 as part of the internship selection process, which could, to Dr. Briscoe-Smith's comments, could, for some students, hopefully not a large number, but delay the process of moving through their studies and increase the cost as well. So I told her I would pass that comment along.
I just wanted to make a comment on that. I have heard that, and I suppose that is a possibility. However, if it is taken after coursework, the intern selection process should have already taken place. If that does become a requirement, then it would actually require people to wait an additional year.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, we actually delay our students applying for internship until they've made satisfactory progress in their dissertation as well.
Okay.
So, because we're concerned of them leaving on an internship, not having made progress on doing their dissertation, finishing the internship, and then being ABD. So again, just the concern was this could possibly increase time to completion and expense.
Seems like my general sense of this discussion is there's a parallel process with regards regulatory changes with the board, as well as any curriculum or organizational changes within universities, both the larger and the smaller universities and programs, as well as internship programs that are all affected by possibly adopting EPPP2. I want to welcome public comments. Maybe you should use this one louder.
That works well. Good afternoon. My name's Catherine Cruiser. I'm the incoming chair as a couple days from now of the CPAGs, California Psych Association Graduate Students. I'm the incoming chair, and my name's Catherine Cruiser. I just had a couple of comments. One, seeking clarification. It was my understanding regarding option 3 that the ASPPB wanted to privilege the APA, CPA accredited institutions by permitting them to be able to seek eligibility to take the EPPP1 early. And option 3 mentions that we can seek pre-degree application for APA and non-APA. I thought that the non-APA was not something that the BOP can decide, but that eligibility criterion was managed by the ASPPB. And so this sounds really great for our non-accredited students, but I was wondering if, again, just seeking clarification, if that wasn't something that we could decide that was an ASPPB level eligibility criterion. And then the follow-up question is just asking a little bit more about who owns or manages the eligibility criterion, or where the lines begin to blur as far as what our board can decide and what ASPPB decides. For example, could there be a situation where the Board of Psychology determines that a student would be eligible to sit, but that ASPPB would deny that application for eligibility? Thank you.
If I could try and answer the first question, and then I'll defer to Dr. Turner for the second question. It's my understanding that ASPBB has put out a couple of different options. Either we could have applicants determine eligibility directly through ASPBB, which is one of the earlier options. Option 3 being that the Board of Psychology would determine the early eligibility criteria, and ASPBB would still accept that. States can determine their eligibility requirements. A couple states have a master's level coursework requirement. We don't. If the more different the eligibility standards are, the more impact it could be to portability of the license. So I would just kind of put that out as a cautionary reminder to the committee or the task force. And if Dr. Turner, you can answer about what ASPBB will accept. I think I kind of answered it, but just to hear from you as well.
Right. Essentially, the reason for the eligibility requirements, they revolve around security, exam security. The early option ASPPB was willing to do for APA and CPA students. The complication being, if we didn't use that standard, there's many different standards across the jurisdiction. So that's the standard that was chosen. In California, having different options, we had recommended, if you would like for your students to have that same option, to change the regulations, and we would essentially accept applications as we do now from the jurisdiction.
Did that answer your question? And any other public comments, questions? Given that there's no more public comments, we can we have a current motion, and we can have a vote.
So we have the motion to adopt option 3 if the board decides to adopt the EPPP Part 2. Kasuga.
Aye.
Fu.
Aye.
Welch Gandy.
Aye.
Bill. Log. Allure.
Aye.
Bloxham.
Aye.
Bradbury. Bradbury, sorry.
Aye.
Pugliati.
Aye.
Chow. Briscoe Smith.
Aye.
Finkelman. Ojeda Beck.
Aye.
Butler. Belik.
Aye.
And this, Dr. Marcel, I'm not on your list.
Oh, I said
Oh,
it.
I'm sorry, but if I
Oh,
misread, I said
Marcel?
aye.
Okay. I thought that was a abstaining.
Motion passed, and maybe now it's a good time to have a lunch break. Okay, we'll resume at 1:30. Thank you.
Mr. Glassbeagle, an excellent job of capturing the sentiment and the discussion items from today to include in the board meeting.
Please feel free to take out the shitty.
So I want to kind of maybe weigh in as a member of the staff, and that absolutely our cover memo can explain some of these things, but in my head, how I see this going is that we would actually have a task force report that would talk about the considerations you took, the conversations we had, the decisions that were made, and then also the regulatory and statutory changes, all as part of the attachments. So it doesn't always wed us to having a super long memo, but maybe an actual task force report, which is a document we can have for posterity or whatever. Yeah, so that way it kind of adequately encompasses all that, and we can share that with you guys as a draft form or something like that before it goes out. So, possibly.
And you're also welcome to attend a board meeting if you want to convey this directly to the full board as well. Okay, so right now, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll resume to the next section of 1388. 5-minute break. Public comment? Public comment after the break. We'll resume the meeting and we'll start with public comments.
Hot mics. Hi, I'm Dr. Jo Linder Crow, CEO of the California Psychological Association, and I guess that I thought I was clear on everything, and now I'm not so sure. So I wanted to ask a couple of clarifying questions. This morning, I asked a couple of questions. One was whether or not the Board of Psychology had the option of deciding whether or not to adopt the EPPP2, and the answer was yes. So now I'm wondering, again, going back to the task force, and wondering just a couple of very straightforward questions. I admit that when I got the letter asking us to send a representative, I was under the impression, because of that very first question, the question about is the adoption of a new exam what California wants to do, that this was a task force that was tasked with making a recommendation to the full board. So I attend all the board meetings, I attend all the committee meetings of the Board of Psychology, and I've also been involved in a lot of task forces and so forth. So one basic question I have, really, is will this task force make a recommendation to the Board of Psychology about whether or not to move forward with the EPPP2? And I think I asked that because it has, the last few minutes of conversation has sort of reverted back to the sort of the underlying assumption that this is, as Renee said, a done deal, like this is the path we're going down. And in my experience, it's just clear, it's helpful to be clear on whether or not that's true or not. Because what I sensed in the room was a kind of a deflation, kind of a confusion about, well, what is the task force for then, if it's not to make a recommendation to the board? And I agree with Ms. Burns that there should be a task force report. I have seen some examples of a task force giving a report with no recommendation, but that is accompanied by the information that says the members of this task force could not agree, or the members of this task force have a difference of opinion, or the task force took a vote and it was split down the middle about what to recommend to the full board. So I think what I'm hearing is that there's just some confusion, again, going back to Dr. Marcial's question of what is the mission and what was the charge of the task force. So that would be one of my questions, of whether or not this task force is going to make a recommendation. And then, is this task force going to meet again before the board meeting in August? Or is this it before the board meeting in August?
Would be it.
This would be it. So then, to the question earlier, going back to that question of, well, what is this task force? I don't want to, well, okay. Bluntly, what is this task force for? I understand working on language, but the Board of Psychology is going to have to do all of this all over again. So another, just one more comment, and that is that it seems a little concerning to me that the language in the minutes, which you approved this morning and have been quoted here now several times, said that this task force agreed that this was not in the best interest of the protection of consumers in the state of California. And that the reason, there's a big but, and that is, but we don't have a good option, but we don't have another exam. And there's something unsettling a little bit about not about doing something that you may think is not the best thing to do, only because there's not a convenient alternative. So this morning again, I think we heard, and I'm not I understand the complexity of what this would mean, and it's a very complex alternative. I give you that, but to just assume that there is no option, I'm not sure is quite accurate from the way I've heard the discussion or the way I've read your documents. So again, if you could just offer some clarification about the next steps for the task force and whether or not at the board meeting in August we should all be prepared for there to be a task force recommendation, or should we be prepared for a task force report that simply kind of reports out the discussion of this group, laying out, as Ms. Burns said, all of the different observations, including the minutes. So that would just help, I think, me in understanding and preparing for being at the board meeting in August and perhaps offering comment.
I think I also just wanted to kind of like voice out that in addition to the concerns that the task force brought up on the last meeting with regards not having an option, there were also a lot of people that voice out the importance of portability, and actually that's also another factor. So it's not just like two things that we're weighing other factors, which includes portability, and I think there was a lot of people that agreed as well that portability is important. So I just wanted to kind of like add that that part of it.
I'd like to say that I agree portability is important, but just from what I'm hearing and what I remember about the last meeting, it seems like everybody's on the same page that this is not the best way to move forward. Could our recommendation just be no? Like, I understand what the implication is, but the board is going to make their own decision anyway. Is that correct? They're tasked with making the decision. If our recommendation is just that this is not in the best interest of consumers and, you know, the people taking the test, then why are we not going to make a recommendation one way or another?
Just one other question about portability. And I don't know where the Board of Psychology is with the ASPPB's program for SciPac. You know, that I thought there was another means of portability that we were dealing with, and it wasn't just through the creation of a new test. Is that not correct? California signed on to the SciPac? Okay. But portability, there are a number of ways of reaching portability, and I understand this may be one of them. And we don't want, those of us who want to change states don't necessarily want to have to take another examination. But I don't think this is the only way of achieving that.
I could also add, I think we are seeing this in a really black and white. Either we voting up or we're voting down, but I would like to put back on the table the third option that we discussed at the beginning about what happens with delaying implementation and seeing. I think the majority of our concerns were around not knowing enough about this new metric, and if we have this third option, I think it would speak to a lot of those concerns, and maybe we can discuss what that third option would look like to put forward to the board as a not yes, not no answer at this point.
Just to add to the I completely agree, but just to add to portability, I wonder whether we're not introducing actually another impediment, because it sounds like different states are going to implement the EPPP potentially differently, and some states may allow students to take Part 1 predoctorally. Other states, I've heard that New York is saying that they're refusing to do that because the education hasn't been completed yet. And so I think that actually is going to be potentially problematic from a portability perspective, depending on which state you're in, when you took the EPPP, and if you later move, you know, what the implications would be.
So, you want to speak to the task force report?
Oh, yes. I think the sentiments that we've discussed about the situation we're in will definitely be conveyed both in written and oral form. I think there is to be frank, what I sense is a desire for an up or down vote, but that needs to be agendized, and that's not been done. So that's where we find ourselves. So, and there is no scheduled task force meeting after this currently, and so that up and down vote.
There's one in October, just not before the August.
Oh, sorry, not before the August board meeting. Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. So, in theory, there wouldn't be that possibility until after the August board meeting. I think we find ourselves with 2020 quickly approaching as I look at my calendar. And the idea of a delayed implementation is dependent on ASPBB agreeing to that delayed implementation for our state. So absence their agreement, that means the option 1 layout that we saw that Ms. Schneider presented would go into effect with or without us doing anything. So if the board took no action, we didn't get the delayed implementation request because we weren't making motions towards a regulatory change, which seems like that's where there would be a potential for some negotiation for that, though not guaranteed. Option 1 would just go into place without any action by the board and without any approval for implementation. So I think so we are in when a lot of different weather patterns come into play and then you find yourself in a really big storm, I think that's where we find ourselves, unfortunately. And I think part of the task force, to the question of what is this task force doing, I think we're trying to navigate out of that. We're trying to find our way out of this, given the situation we're in, and it's not particularly pretty. I also do think that we have surfaced a lot of issues that we do need to talk about, even with the lack of even if we don't do anything. So I think, and I hope we get to it, which is the section that was brought up earlier about what does completion of academic coursework mean? I mean, that has surfaced, and hearing from UCLA's perspective, what language needs to come through of that. Or from, I don't think we would have surfaced Dr. Montez's comments about the fail-safe option if we didn't have that conversation. So I wouldn't want to be too dismissive of this process of engagement because I think we have surfaced those issues. And so that's where I leave my comments. I know others would want to talk.
If I could just say, I'm less concerned about an up or down vote than our sentiments, the sentiments you've been hearing being communicated to the board. You know, I'm assuming that the board will make the correct decision, you know, and take into account the fact that we've taken time to get together, express our concerns, information from different points of view. I would like to suggest, though, there may be a third alternative in this. I mean, as Ms. Sorek mentioned, I mean, there are 1,000 California candidates who take the EPPP, which I assume is a fairly large percentage of the individuals in the country that take the exam. And if California has reservations about implementing a new test, you know, and is even considering an alternative, perhaps it might put some pressure on ASPPB to delay this and give us more time to discuss it and talk about it. I mean, you know, I think California it's the big dog in the room in one sense and stuff, and that we should use that in terms of having this discussion instead of feeling I won't use the word railroaded, but, you know, forced to make a decision that many of us are very uncomfortable with.
And I think that option of another test isn't available to us without this discussion we're having now about that fail-safe. So I think that's why we are having this discussion of those regulatory changes.
I agree, but it's also under the assumption that should we not agree to implement this test on January 1, 2020, that ASPPB is just going to leave the room, no longer offer the test, you know, to 1,000 people in California. That's what I'm referring to.
And we're definitely going to convey the sentiment of this task force on the full board meeting, which will be in August, and Mr. Fu will be the one to deliver both the oral report with regards that. Do you wanna speak?
I think
to that?
Dr. Turner could attest that I will be fairly honest about my opinions about the EPPP based on our last conversation at the last Taskforce meeting. So I think that sentiment will be easily conveyed by me, for sure. And to Dr. Kasuga's point, I think we are having it at the right institute, and the invitation is for people to, including members of the task force, to join us if you're able to share, to echo and share and use the language that you would like to use to convey to the board.
Okay. Dr. Briscoe.
I was just going to say that, I think as you were articulating, that I think that the process is appropriate. We're definitely voicing a whole lot of things, but I want to be clear. So it sounds like there is no option of a vote then because it's not on the agenda. That's true? Okay.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so, I think the only thing I would kind of say to that is I do think that while the sentiments can be conveyed and I have trust in the process that they will be conveyed, I think there is a utility at some point to have this task force engage in a vote to demonstrate. Also, I'm quite concerned about perhaps there are folks that are really excited about this, but I've, bullied them into silence. I don't know. I haven't heard those kind of conversations here. So the utility of a vote is the ability to actually represent what's being said here, and there have been a couple of loud, dominant voices, mine, the utility of the process and the vote is allowing other folks to speak to the other concerns. So I understand and respect that the process cannot do so now, but I think there would be utility in actually having a vote so that we could have a representation about what people are really saying. And that also in the ability to kind of represent to the board as to whether or not this was just a couple of loud folks from the right, or is it from, how is the sentiment being said by many, many others as well?
Duly noted, and we can definitely talk about that on agenda number 8 for recommendations for agenda items in future task force meetings. So, having said that, we can resume agenda item number 7, and okay.
Clarifying question about BOP meeting in August. Am I understanding correctly that it is during that meeting there will be a decision made, or the actual decision made by the board whether or not you're the state of California moving with the EPPP? Am I understanding it correctly that it is during that meeting that the decision by the board will be made? So in fact, we will not be making a vote that is going to be relevant to any processes moving forward. Is that correct? I mean, I think I'm responding to your comment that it was duly noted and will be put for future agenda. And I'm not sure what agenda if the decision will be made in August and we're meeting in October. So I didn't understand the comment.
Well, I think I'm not entirely sure what the intent was, but it will be on the agenda. What the board does, up to the board. But it will be on the agenda about which way it wants to go forward. And if it decides that, if the board decides, hey, we need more information, we want we want to see a specific recommendation from the task force, they may decide to send it back here, but it will be on the agenda. Whether they make a decision, board.
But they will make a decision in August without our recommendation or vote. Am I right about that?
So as Ms. Marks mentioned earlier, at the last task force meeting, there was a discussion and an agreement that that this, in a sense, this ship has sailed. We have some concerns. We want to lay out those concerns to ASPBB. There wasn't a contingency clause as part of that motion. If the letter says this, then we will recommend that, or we're going to need to bring that decision back to the task force. That wasn't conveyed at the last meeting, so I think for agenda creation purposes, we didn't include that on the agenda because the minutes reflected that there was a discussion and there was an agreement made by the task force members that despite not necessarily agreeing with moving forward with the part two, that there was enough concern that we didn't have a backup plan in place, so we need to kind of plan and be prepared for this coming, because we don't have a state exam as a backup. And as Mr. Fu had mentioned, option one would be the default. So we would be moving forward with part two, and we would have that portability issue with the early eligibility from another state and so on and so forth. So just kind of going back to Dr. Linda Crow's question. So the first meeting, there was discussion. There was an agreement that we may not completely like this or support this, but this is coming. So let's lay out our concerns. Let's bring some information back. And then let's look at how would we be prepared to implement this. We did, as a staff, prepare for 3 separate meetings just to make sure we got through all the language and got through the different options on how would this look for January 1, 2020. So the hope is that at the end of the day today, we will have gone through both of the regulatory sections. We've completed the statutory sections, bringing that recommendation to the full board in August. And then if the board wants more information or wants the task force to convene again, we have a meeting scheduled for October in order to complete that. Does that wrap things up at all, or?
Okay. I hear what you're saying. So I'm understanding what you're saying, and I think we are really, in a way, put in a position to cope with the circumstances that we are facing. Is that strong of a statement to make?
I think cope is a good word.
Okay. So the purpose of this task force is to cope with the circumstances with only one option put forth.
Well, the agenda for today is to have a recommendation, because the board, whether we make a decision today or not, will have this on their agenda, and we want everyone's opinion to be accounted for recommendations. So the board will have as much information when they make the decision in August. So how that's gonna look like is based on the things that we're gonna relate to the full board. So I think that relaying all our concerns and issues will be duly noted by the board. I mean, I won't be there on in August, but this process is basically to provide the full board with as much information. And I understand that some of it that the whole task force doesn't have all the information it needs, as you've laid out, and have a lot of reservations, and that's going to be relayed to the full board. So that way, when the full board meets in August, they will have as much information to make a decision for what's going to be good for California moving forward. Does that help? Answer your question.
I'll take your answer.
Just to follow up a little bit on this idea of a vote, and I realize that because it's not on the agenda, we can't do that, but sometimes there's a straw vote that's taken, and I'm wondering if it's possible to go that route and include that in the report, just as a way of conveying the sentiment, and as Allison mentioned, we don't know if everybody shares the same sentiment or not. Some of us have spoken more than others, and so I don't know if that information's helpful.
I think the issue there is the absence of an item on the agenda doesn't just prevent voting, it prevents the discussion as well. So I think what we've been doing is, what we've been doing is trying to figure out really what the recommendation is going forward to the board, but the absence of an item on the agenda to specifically develop a recommendation to the board about whether or not to implement the EPPP2 isn't there, and so it's not just that you can't have a formal vote, it's that can't be discussed.
Okay.
It's the Open Meetings Act.
So even though we were asked to consider the response from ASPPB, and to the extent that we find that, let's say that while certainly they, provided very compelling reasons in some instances, but perhaps less compelling in other instances, that based on that information, it sounds like we're not allowed to have try to form some consensus about how we feel about that in light of the broader discussion. So, not being very clear, yeah.
So I think that question is more for Ms. Marks. So I'm waiting for.
If I understand correctly, what you're asking is, so specifically on the agenda was item number 5, which is review and discussion of ASPPB's response to the EPPP2 task force letter regarding concerns and questions and concerns. So that's, I think, specifically what you're asking about is we were asked to consider that. I think the minutes would certainly reflect a rather in-depth discussion between the task force members and the representative from ASPPB about those questions and concerns, and those certainly would be provided to the board in the form of draft minutes and in the form of a report from the task force, either chair or chair. If Mr. Fu is the vice chair, I don't know. Did I just nominate you? I don't know. So that discussion and those concerns would definitely be submitted to the board. I don't know that anticipated a formal vote on the implementation. As I said earlier, what I saw were those discussions around payments and implementation dates and what other models did you look at, etc. So I would, unless Mr. Fu says otherwise, I think he had a very good grasp of what the concerns were that were discussed during that item, and those would definitely be relayed to the board.
Is it also correct, though, because I'm hearing that if it wasn't on the agenda, that it can't be formally discussed? Does that also mean that a member of the task force couldn't make a motion for a vote regarding? I mean, there's a request to do this in a straw vote kind of mechanism, but I just want to clarify. So I couldn't make a motion to vote regarding whether or not we wanted to recommend this or not.
The Open Meetings Act says that a body such as this can only discuss what's on the agenda so that the public knows what's available for being discussed. I don't think it was because as we sort of walked it through that what was relayed last time was somewhat of a acceptance, as you will, that the ASPPB was going down this road. There were concerns relayed to ASPPB about certain things, but I didn't see that this was coming back to this task force have a discussion and vote specifically on a recommendation as to whether or not the board should implement the EPPP. So if it's not on the agenda, the law says you can't discuss it, you can't vote on it. It doesn't mean, as I said, that all of that discussion around those specific concerns that the task force members had and laid out with the representative, with Dr. Turner, that won't be communicated, because I believe it would, both in the way of the task force report as well as the minutes from the April meeting and the draft minutes from this meeting.
Okay, so we're gonna resume the agenda item. So just to recap, we talked about 1388B and discussed adding a fail-safe mechanism. And any questions about C?
Is the 1388C the one that we're talking about, the academic coursework? Is that the one that we're discussing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On from B to C. Now we're talking about the academic part. I'm sorry, I was confused because I thought we hadn't finished conversation about the. Rather, we're wrapping in the fail-safe conversation into.
Yes, I think I think there was a general consensus.
Thank you.
To include the fail-safe option in the final recommendation, and process-wise, we were going to just do it all 1380 as a package.
So we're moving on to C. Any comments?
I guess I'm just again focusing on the all required, the last, I'm sorry, line. But the last part of that, line 25, completed all required coursework, academic coursework of a qualifying doctorate degree. Again, does that just kind of go back to how programs define what's the qualifying, all the required coursework for the qualifying degree? Because I'm sure most, and maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling most programs actually consider finishing up dissertation as well as internship as part of completing the doctoral program or getting a qualifying doctorate degree.
Do you want to, is your recommendation to make it specific or expand upon the definition on the language?
I would just, I would be curious, and especially for people from the larger universities and also smaller as well, the programs, just to kind of clarify what kind of language needs to be included in the academic coursework part of it.
I have a question as far as your academic program. When you say internship as being part of the coursework, are you referring to the formal internship or are you referring to practicum?
In the case of I think I can speak broadly for the UC system, not just UCLA. It would be both.
Yeah,
But before you can go to the formal internship, all the academic coursework plus the practicum would have to be completed before you can go into the formal internship? Is that how it works?
Okay, it depends a little bit also when you're saying all the formal coursework. So at least, for instance, at UCLA, a student needs to be registered while they're completing their dissertation. So there's a course title and that they are registered in that course. And in fact, if they have not completed, let's say, the dissertation, the final defense, during the internship, they then need to come back, let's say registered. What typically happens is register during the summer in that course, and that's and then pass their final dissertation defense, and then they're given a grade for that course, and then they're seen as effectively having completed all of their coursework.
I think for most of us, all the academic requirements, including practicum, internship, dissertation, are basically considered for the academic records to the registrar's office a course. They usually have a course designation, number of credits, tuition that's paid for that, which determines eligibility for financial aid and whatnot. So it's not a simple, it's not, you simply can't just say courses or coursework without making more of a distinction in that. I mean, if the intention is to exclude the internship, patient, then that probably needs to be specified.
There's a cutoff known to us that in terms of what is the prerequisite in the knowledge, kind of this foundational knowledge that one assumes that one needs to have in order to presumably pass the exam. Is that it's not a master degree, right? Just to be clear. So like other disciplines, like MFTs don't take EPPP, is that correct? So it's only for us. It's for students, for psychologists to be. Am I correct? So what is the cutoff in the coursework or in the body of knowledge? I don't know, units. I'm not sure the language, the good language to put to my question. Do we know that? So what's the cutoff? I mean, so more specifically, we can't expect for the first year student to take the exam and pass. That would probably say something about either exam or a student. So is it the second year, third year? What are we talking about? And are those years attached to a certain number of units? Is I guess what I'm asking. Because really the issue is about the timeline. The longer we're going to be postponing, the more it's going to be impacting the timeline. So the less competitive psychology is going to get in the state of California. I mean, let's just get to the chase. So what we're trying to do, I think, is to shift the timeline earlier and earlier as much as possible so that at least it's comparable to what we have right now with the implementation of additional exam. So my question is, what's the cutoff? What's the cutoff in the knowledge? Do we know that?
I don't think, is Dr. Turner still here?
He just left.
Of course. But I've been into some of these meetings and some of these discussions to move it forward were based on concerns that students had of APAGs, for example. And so my understanding is that it meant to include everything except for dissertation and internship. So all the coursework except for those two issues. And I think we should simply include language that says exclusive of internship and dissertation in this. And I think that'll cover, I know that only partially answers your question. I don't have a definitive answer, but my understanding from having been at these discussions with the ASPBB about the timing of it was that it meant after all the academic coursework except for internship and dissertation.
Was it also mentioned before, however, that there were some programs that were doing it as early as the third year? I seem to remember Dr. Turner referencing that several times. Did I mishear that, or?
No, you didn't.
I guess I raised that as a concern, just again to slow down the process. That actually, again, the timeline consideration I think is quite significant. This kind of but for dissertation and internship would basically put it into this kind of last year. But if there are other programs in other places that are actually moving it forward, then I think this issue of kind of competitiveness, timing is actually quite relevant.
Important, right.
And important. And also, while I am hearing that there perhaps are student concerns, I think the quick fix for a program would actually be to turn the EPPP into the competency-based exam, just to have that be there. And I want to raise that students have concerns about that, but that's why this kind of specification within the regulation is actually quite important, that should we provide any wiggle room to push it further back, I could see programs might actually do that.
I don't know the answer to that. So.
And if I can just raise an issue, having just gone through a WASC reaccreditation and receiving a tremendous amount of criticism from WASC, because we tend to use the APA learning outcomes. We have used our results, which have been very good on the EPPP, the licensing exam, the pass rates. And frankly, those were unacceptable to WASC. WAST actually said that, we do not want to rely on a professional organization's accreditation standards and licensing exams, that you have to establish your own learning outcomes, student learning outcomes, which includes your own, they didn't say comps, but, your own form. So it's a little naive to think that we can all simply substitute the EPPP1 for a comps exam. That's not acceptable to our regional accrediting agencies.
Okay, so currently, I guess the majority of the task force members want to add academic coursework exclusive of internship and dissertation to make it a little bit clearer that academic coursework term as it is in this as part of the regulation.
Is there any possibility just to maintain flexibility for programs? So if a program decides, for instance, that no, they think that the dissertation or at least or some portion of it needs to be part of the academic coursework before they will certify, allowing a student to go on, that we can somehow incorporate that language in as well, so that it's not necessarily a constraint, but is another option, so that, because otherwise it does feel like the state board is determining for the programs what constitutes academic coursework.
My thought on that, sorry, it was your issue as Stephanie's coming up, is that you can have both with the current language, with the exception. You can decide whether or not you want to have the dissertation proposal accepted or completed prior to internship. But this gives them the option of sitting for the EPPP if it's not. So I understand your concerns, but the language already gives you that flexibility to decide whether or not to require the dissertation or not. That makes sense?
Hello. Yes, so that's actually what I wanted to add to. I think the proposed language here give the program the flexibility to determine whether the students meet their requirements to take the exam. So I think that's why the language is written this way, to include the option. So I think if we restrict it to complete dissertation, I think it might be creating more barriers to students than current proposed language. So just to keep it broad, so to give program, because program has the best knowledge of what composed of like a completion of the requirement or the student where they are at. So that's why we have that flexibility and broadness incorporated in the language.
So maybe I misunderstood. I thought the language was that the student would be eligible, assuming they've completed all the coursework with the exception of dissertation and the internship. So a student may then say, based on the language that's in these regulations, I am eligible. But a program might decide that they don't support that the student is eligible. They feel that as part of their education, let's say they have to pass the preliminary oral exam, so that they've moved, one step further in terms of their dissertation work. But if it's stated that the student is eligible, then the program really doesn't seem like they have much recourse to say, no, we're not going to certify you, because that would be contrary to what's stated, in the regulations.
I'm sorry, Stephanie. I disagree because we set standards for KPIC that are higher than the BOP standards. APA accredited schools set standards that are higher than the BOP standards already. It's a minimum that's requirement. Academic programs can obviously set higher standards and do to this. Currently, so I don't think it is being in conflict.
So you can set your own standards, and other programs will also be able to set their own standards and certify their students to take the EPPP upon completion of their coursework, exclusive of internship and dissertation.
Would it be possible to add that language, so at minimum, and then exclusive of internship and dissertation, and then programs can move it, make it more rigorous but not less? Is that what I'm understanding? Make the requirements higher or lower depending on the program? If we set a minimum?
I guess I would only say that the BOP regs aren't that explicit right now. So why are we adding it to it now at this point?
Well, keep in mind that we actually limit the Palo Alto University who can apply for internship, because we don't want students applying too early and having our acceptance rate low, even though a student might feel that he or she's qualified and would like to do it. So there could be, by leaving it open to the discretion of programs, you might have programs saying, no, you can't sit for the EPPP1, even though the student feels prepared, wants to, and is ready. So I don't know if you just be aware that the discretion, leaving it to the discretion of programs, they have their own concerns that are not necessarily the concerns of the student per se.
I think that the language says to satisfy this requirement kind of like sets the stage that it is a minimum to be able to take the EPPP.
Is that what I'm hearing?
I think we're adding exclusive of internship.
We
and
are
dissertation.
adding. Okay, we are adding it. Yeah, because that's not what I understood.
Okay, I was just clarifying because there seemed to be some disagreement in the group about being more general and just saying coursework, or being less general and more specific and including the exclusive of dissertation and internship.
We're doing both. So we're being more, I'm sorry.
I can't see
I can read
the
the language.
We're being more specific and specifically saying excluding dissertation and internship, but we're being more general and not adding additional language. So I guess we're balancing it. Sorry, I had to jump in.
The final definition, I'm
Read
sorry,
it.
I can't see.
To satisfy this requirement, the applicant shall submit to the board a written certification from the registrar or training director of the educational institutional program stating that the applicant has completed all required academic coursework in Prince, exclusive of internship and dissertation, of a qualifying doctorate degree.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to D. Any comments?
I just want to clarify that this is the same criteria that ASPPB established. Basically, they want people to just take the second part of the EPPP after internship and getting their degree conferred, not at the end of like the postdoc. Okay.
F. Not a lot on that. Changes to G. And then
Quick clarification on G, just that the language that they're saying is accept the passing score recommended is essentially saying the same thing as apply a scaled score as recommended. Yeah, just make it more clear.
Yeah, that is correct.
Sorry.
first. So that should be it for 1388. Okay. Okay, so we'll continue the discussion. We'll have Ms. Snyder go through 1388.6.
Okay, we didn't make any changes for 1388.6. These changes that you see here were done by the licensing committee.
Okay.
So
That's good. How about 1389?
same for 1389 and 1389.1. Those were changes made by the licensing committee.
So at this point, we have a motion.
So before I make the motion, I just want to make the comment that I definitely agree with the sense of dissatisfaction about not having that on the agenda item today, and I think that is an accurate. I mean that I think is an issue, and so I think as a part of the report out, whatever that report out is, will reflect that while it was on the agenda item for the first meeting we had in April, that it wasn't on the agenda for today, and as a consequence, because of the rules that which we're bound by with the Open Meetings Act, we couldn't have that discussion in a meaningful way, and that was that was an obstacle to, I think, some of the sentiments that may have been surfaced through potentially having that item on the agenda. So I want to make that clear that will be brought up and said, and so that the board also realizes that they could have the option to make sure that there's that October, so they would have that full understanding and ability to bring it back to this task force at our August meeting for our task force October meeting. So I will say that. And so to the motion, I'm gonna see if I get this right, which is to move 1388 as amended to include a fail-safe option in 1388.B, to include I don't have the specific wording, but the lines discussed in 1388.C, for the board to consider if the board decides to adopt or continue with the EPPP. Outside of that motion, the report will be that there were serious concerns about the EPPP. The sentiment from both meetings was that this was a significant issue, that we felt like we were in a bind, and that we didn't have the opportunity at the second meeting to address the agenda item that we would have liked to see. But that's not in the motion, that's just a commentary, editorial.
Anyone second that?
Second the motion.
Discussion?
I know we just had a lot of discussion, but let's try to make it short. In paragraph B, I question again whether or not exam revision 618 is really needed, if it's being too specific. And I think it probably might be easier if we want to make later changes to not have that language in there.
So I think this incorporate a form by reference to the rec, so it just to make it clear to both public and the board that which form they're gonna use. So this is just really to specify the form that they use.
But it doesn't say just this form, it says what revision of the form. So if you revise the form again, you're going to have to change this language again.
Yes.
Yes.
Required.
Required, okay, sorry. That's why I need lawyers and administrators, thank you.
When you're specifying a form that, in this case, an applicant needs to use, there are several ways to do it. You can put in a specific revision date, as we've done. You can spell out everything that, all the data points that must be on the form, or you can actually have a picture of the form. You can actually include the form in the regs, so probably the easiest way to go about it.
Understood, thanks.
Public comment? Seeing as there's none, are we ready for the vote?
Yep, okay. So we have the motion to accept 1388 as amended to include a fail-safe option in B and clarification of the academic coursework in C for the board to consider if the board decides to continue with the EPPP. Kasuga.
Aye.
Fu.
Aye.
Welch Gandy.
Aye.
Marcel.
Aye.
Bahilog. Delure.
Aye.
Bloxham.
Aye.
E. Bradbury.
Aye.
Uliati.
Aye.
Chow. Briscoe Smith.
Aye.
Finkelman.
Aye.
Ohita Beck.
Aye.
Sedler. Aye. Bellick.
Aye.
That motion passes.
So now we're gonna talk about agenda number 8, and I know that as part of the recommendations for agenda items for future task force meetings, a lot of it might be ambiguous because we don't know what's gonna be accomplished in the upcoming full board meeting. But then I think that we still have to put forth all of our agenda items that we want to discuss that we think is pertinent. That way it will be included in the future agenda.
I'm getting eyes. So I guess I would like to request that a vote is conducted at that time, while also articulating that the vote's going to happen after an August meeting. So it feels a little cart after the horse, before the... I don't know how that works, but it feels out of sequencing. But I think if there's still an opportunity for folks and members to articulate their concern and to go on record with that, I think it would be appropriate. So I'd like to ask that the agenda includes a vote as to whether or not this task force supports moving forward with the implementation of the EPPP.
I'd like to request if there is another meeting with this group to get more information from ASPPB about the actual test. I mean, I've only heard about the different types of items, the use of avatars, and I'm just extremely curious as to how such an examination is actually going to test for competency to be a licensed clinical psychologist. I'd like to, if possible, get more information. I just think we're being forced to potentially implement something without actually knowing what it is exactly.
On the first meeting, we had like a presentation by ASPPB, but I think that by the time October comes around, there might be new information, and that might include the sample items that they said that they might be coming up with. So I think that it's good to revisit kind of like a follow-up with ASPPB with regards to actual test. Is that?
Yeah, is that the presentation? Is that available someplace?
Yes.
Yes, please. Thank you.
It's also available online. ASPB has that slide deck that was utilized in the previous notes online. And I would just say, after kind of scouring through it, it does not address the questions that you're asking in terms of what it looks like. It's the information that you have regarding use of avatars, multiple right answers, variations in that kind of part. So what you can kind of read online is what it is. So I agree with it.
Were there sample items?
No.
Oh, okay, that's what I would actually be. I mean, maybe they don't want to share that because of validity and test protecting the test. But I've read the material. I'm actually curious as to see how this actually tests for competency.
They have a fake sample item.
Do? Okay.
Yeah, which just have you go through the motion of a, I think it's the multiple sequence where, you know, it's like you answer something and then there's more information.
Based on your answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think he also mentioned today that he would be sending us some items for at the end of the conclusion of the meeting. He made a quick comment about it, but we should probably follow up about that.
I think we should include in that then specifically regarding how it better protects the California consumers from our current exam, because I've been to many meetings and I've never got that answer adequately answered. That question adequately answered.
I would like to include an agenda item to follow up on a number of comments this morning made that we're considering different options. And the options were never kind of discussed or listed specifically as it relates to the timeline of the implementation. So we're considering a number of options, and that was the answer. And I wasn't sure what were the actual options to different questions that we asked, and what is the timeline in that consideration.
So, just to clarify, you wanted the timeline with regards delayed implementation of EPPP and also timeline for a possible alternative exam. Is that your question?
I think I'm responding to their response to our questions from previous meeting and how unsatisfactory to some extent it was by the nature of it being a bit too vague, more vague than we see. And in response to that today, response was non-specific as well, and the best that we got was we're considering number of options, or this is on the table, or we're thinking about it. So what specifically are you thinking about it, and what is the timeline of your thoughts being implemented?
So basically, ASPPB's response to the delayed implementation, which wasn't clarified today by
that, as well as the financial aspect, let's say, of implement. So it's more than just the delayed implementation. It's
Okay.
just financial is another piece that stands out for me.
And to piggyback off that, I feel like the timelines that I've seen for the rollout have been completely vague. They haven't really had any sort of concrete details to them. It's been like, we're gonna roll it out here, we're gonna do this here, but there's only like 3 or 4 bullet points. Maybe we could get like more details about when they're gonna complete, their item analysis, and when they're gonna complete validating the test and all of that, and also when they're gonna have testing materials available for someone like me to, because he was vague about that in his response earlier as well.
Rick, is it possible for us to have ASPPB again for the October meeting?
What I will do is I will request, if it's possible, to have a representative at the board's August meeting, because I think it would be very helpful for the discussion. I also need to find out, I know he mentioned October was the board of directors meeting for ASPPB, and a lot of these questions are contingent on that meeting, and our meeting here is scheduled for October 18th. So I just want to make sure if you guys are wanting more information to discuss, that we have the information to provide. Otherwise, it might not be a very productive meeting if we don't have the information you guys need to have that discussion. So.
And if we could just add to the ASPPB list, also there was the stipulation that the requirement would be for APA or CPA accreditation. Dr. Turner said he thought perhaps PC-SAS was not included, and that might have been an oversight, so it'd be helpful to get clarification on that.
I have also on the ASPPB list. I just wanted to kind of follow up on the timeline issue, specifically about their beta testing. Maybe I misheard it, but I thought I heard them say that beta testing would be done by people newly licensed professionals. So I would like a date on when that beta testing is going to be happening, and some preliminary results from it, if possible, if they have a timeline to provide us with that as well.
So, is it possible for us to give them this information?
I'm looking at the direction of staff. Do you feel like perhaps Mr. Glassbeagle and or Ms. Burns can try and recap the list of questions to follow up with ASPPB before we head out today, just so we know we've captured everything?
Let me go ahead and recap. I have request a vote on whether the task force recommends implementation of the EPPP2. Get more information from ASPPB on the items included in the test and how it will actually test for competency. Also for ASPPB, okay, the rest of these are all for ASPPB. We'll just start that with that one. We want more information on how this will help protect California consumers. We also want to know the decisions and alternatives and their timelines for implementation of those considerations, including ASPPB's timeline for the rollout of the examination, with details on validating the test, when materials will be available, and that will request ASPPB rep at the August board meeting and may need to move our October meeting due to ASPPB's meeting. Directors meeting, sorry. We also want clarification on PC SAS inclusion, and then clarification on when the beta testing will happen, and when we would get results on that beta testing.
I just wanted to add to the list the cost considerations. They mentioned that it's...
Is that to ASPPB or us?
To ASPPB, okay. Cost considerations, because Dr. Turner earlier mentioned that they're still talking about that with their own board with regards to making it more affordable. I just want to follow up on it.
My understanding was that if the board chose to go with option 3, that the non-APA and APA approved student programs was not a concern, because in option 3, it's up to the board to accept whoever they want.
That's my understanding too.
So I don't know if we need clarification again from ASPPB.
I think it would be helpful because when we're training our students, we don't know that they're necessarily going to stay in California. And so from the perspective of being the people who are in charge of educating individuals and preparing them to be able to go off and complete their careers, it does seem to me that it's important to know that.
But wouldn't that be each state's purview?
Well, so that if a student, for instance, let's say graduates from a California program and they decide to, let's say, move to another state, and that state is relying on ASPPB's definition of who can qualify to take the test or not, that could preclude the student from perhaps taking the test.
In another state?
In another state. But they were trained in California, and so that's why I think it's, as an educator in California, I think it's important to get some clarification on the issue.
Any other recommendations for agenda items?
It's not an agenda item, but I just want to kind of go back to what Mr. Fu will be presenting to the board. So I trust that you will convey the sentiments we felt around here about the implementing the EPPP, especially the part 2. And what also just struck me was, I think Renee, like you had mentioned that by us just sort of talking about option 3, it's sort of this like tacit approval that we are going forward with it. But what is missing from that discussion is the alternative, which is what if we vote to not adopt EPPP. And I wonder if it would be helpful to kind of specify to the board, or actually emphasize to the board, that maybe our language around a fail-safe mechanism is sort of the alternative, that we have considered the alternative. I think that would be important to convey that we're not doing this tacit approval by just sort of saying this is option 3 and this is the most viable path.
Thank you.
I was fiercely typing to capture that sentiment, and I will report back on that.
Wanted to add another, if we could get the mandate task force in writing, just to make sure that October will be our last meeting, make sure that that's tied off appropriately.
Can clarify that further on the full board meeting, Mr. Fu.
In terms of obtaining a printed
No, just
charge?
like the mandate of the task force.
I think my understanding is that maybe I misheard, but Ms. Ojeda Beck would like a printed copy of it at your next board meeting, or excuse me, at our, I should say, next task force meeting in October.
Oh, you wanted a printed copy?
Or if there could be some clarification around what it is, and then whatever is decided, if that could be brought to us, make sure we're addressing everything.
I think it's good to lay it out too, that like there was some confusion with regards the charge. That's what I was like alluding to.
Oh, duly noted. Happy to make a mention of that as well.
And then a printed copy by the next meeting. Other recommendations? Seeing as there's none. Are there any public suggestions for future agenda items? Seeing as there's none as well in the public, I would like to thank everyone for coming to today's task force meeting. I appreciate all the feedback that has been brought forward, and I understand that there's a lot of strong sentiments with regards this process that we're going through, but I'm hopeful that that at the end of this road that we'll have something that considers the concerns of all the stakeholders, and that's why I think that it's important to always bring up the points that we're all bringing up. I just wanted to kind of like repeat what Mr. Fu voiced out earlier, that in our engagement in today's meeting, that we've uncovered a lot of really important points to be considered, and even things that I have not personally considered. So I really appreciate everyone's opinion, strong and colorful opinion about what we're tackling today. And we're all adjourned. Oh, need the motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, now I can use my gavel.